At exactly 8:17 on a Monday morning, my son called while I was drinking coffee in my office. "Old man, the company isn't yours anymore. Be out of the office by Monday." I could hear his wife laughing in the background. After 48 years of building everything from the ground up, he really thought one phone call was enough to push me out. So I asked him just one question. "Did you read all the paperwork?" He laughed mockingly. But a few seconds later, the silence on the other end of the line told me that something was very, very wrong. This story won't leave you unchanged. Before we dive in, drop a quick comment. Have you ever stood up to someone you loved because it was the right thing, yes or no? Your perspective might help someone else today. Some details have been fictionalized for storytelling. What matters most is the lesson at the heart of this story. Some betrayals arrive at your ribs with a polished blade. Mine was delivered through a speakerphone on a crisp Monday morning while I sat quietly sipping black coffee in an office my own son believed he had already stripped from my grasp. My name is Vernon Gallagher. I am 73 years old, and over the course of 48 grueling years, I built an $800 million empire out of nothing but raw mud structural steel and sheer willpower. That particular Monday morning in early November, I sat in my spacious home office in the River Oaks neighborhood of Houston, watching the pale autumn sunrise bleed through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. My coffee was cooling slowly inside a heavy ceramic mug that my late wife Joan had bought for me back in 1981. She has been gone for 11 years now, but I still use that exact same mug every single day. I still drink my coffee completely black. I still sit in this identical high-backed leather chair at precisely 7:30 every morning. Rigid routine is the fundamental discipline that separates true engineers from hopeless dreamers. The telephone rang loudly at exactly 8:17. I knew it was Keith before I even glanced down at the illuminated screen. He always made it a point to call it exactly 17 minutes past the hour, because he had read in some trendy management book that utilizing odd numbers makes a businessman memorable to others. Keith Gallagher, my 42-year-old son, currently serving as the executive vice president of Gallagher Precision Manufacturing, the very company I painstakingly constructed while he was still wearing diapers. This was the same boy who used to proudly wear my oversized yellow hard hat on dusty construction sites. Now he was the grown man who had thoroughly rehearsed his own father's betrayal until it sounded like standard corporate business. "Dad," he said. There was no good morning, no polite "how are you?" Just my cold title delivered precisely like a line item on a meeting agenda. "Keith," I replied evenly, "we've made a final decision." He used the word "we," not "I." He was already cowardly hiding himself behind a convenient plural. "We're selling the entire company. It's absolutely the right strategic move." Apex Industries came forward and made an aggressive offer that we simply cannot refuse. A totally clean exit, a remarkably strong valuation multiple, and everyone wins. I took a slow sip of my coffee. It had already gone completely lukewarm. I chose not to say anything at all. "You are going to need to completely clear out your office by next Monday," he continued. His voice possessed that stiff, practiced steadiness that people always employ when they are trying desperately to lie to themselves just as much as to you. "We'll personally handle the organizational transition. You'll be incredibly well taken care of. A foul, generous retirement package, ongoing consultation fees, the whole 9 yards. But we absolutely need you completely out of daily operations, effective immediately." In the background of the call, I heard it clearly, a faint musical and thoroughly victorious laugh. Colleen. She was Keith's second wife, a 38-year-old Wharton MBA graduate with a ferocious, calculating ambition buried so deeply beneath her polished exterior that it often looked like genuine charm. She had strategically moved into my son's personal life 3 years ago, and she had successfully integrated into his bank account just 6 short months later. Now she was nested firmly in his ear, and her quiet laughter told me absolutely everything I needed to know about exactly who had been rehearsing this cold script with him. "Are you completely sure about this, Keith?" I asked quietly. The heavy question hung silently in the air for 3 seconds, perhaps 4. You see, you need to understand something vital about the nature of betrayal. It is never the cruel act itself that truly matters. It is always what the betrayer does not know about you. Keith honestly believed he was delivering an absolute ultimatum. He mistakenly thought that 48 long years of sweat, sacrifice, and steel could be casually sold off like a damaged used car simply because his name happened to be printed on the official letterhead while mine was on a corporate retirement countdown clock. He was dead wrong. I am more sure of this than anything else in my entire life, he asserted. This is happening, Dad. I'm truly sorry that you just can't see that this is the right move for everyone. I see it, I said. Another long pause stretched between us. He had obviously expected explosive anger from me, shouting. Perhaps even desperate tears, the image of a broken, fragile old man pathetically clinging to his fading legacy, while the aggressive young lions took complete control. I gave him absolutely none of it. Good, he finally muttered. Then we are perfectly clear. I'll have Marcus drive over with the official paperwork this afternoon. All right. That's it. Now his tone sounded visibly uncertain, heavily suspicious. You're not even going to fight this at all. I turned my gaze outward to look at the vast Houston skyline. Somewhere out there, far past the gleaming glass towers and the crawling morning traffic, sat the original manufacturing plant I had built in 1981 with nothing but $100,000 loan and a firm handshake. There were 340 dedicated workers, punching their time cards right now, most of them second-generation employees, the actual sons and daughters of the hardworking men I had originally hired when Keith was still learning to walk. We had 3,200 total employees spread across 4 massive facilities: pensions, health insurance, real families. My son was about to heartlessly sell all of it to a predatory private equity firm that would completely gut the entire operation for parts within 18 months. No, Keith, I said softly, I'm not going to fight you. He exhaled deeply. It was relief, perhaps, or maybe it was a tinge of sharp disappointment that I wasn't giving him the grand explosive confrontation he had spent so much time steeling himself for. Okay, good. This is really good, Dad. You'll see. It's just time. The phone line went completely dead. I set the device down onto the surface of my desk, the exact same solid oak desk I had personally bought at an estate sale back in 1979, beautifully scarred with old coffee rings and faded blueprint smudges. My hand remained perfectly steady. My pulse was entirely normal. Joan always used to say that I had absolute ice water running through my veins whenever things got terribly bad, and she wasn't entirely wrong about that. But it wasn't cold ice that morning. It was something far chillier. It was a calculated reality I had been preparing for longer than my own son had been alive on this earth. Because here is the crucial piece of information that Keith did not know. I do not actually own Gallagher Precision Manufacturing, the Gallagher legacy. Trust does. It is a highly specialized legal entity I quietly created back in 1993, 33 years ago when Keith was merely a 12-year-old boy who still thought the term corporate structure referred to the metal scaffolding on our active job sites. The trust permanently holds 72% of all voting shares. The corporate board that Keith foolishly thinks he controls, they don't actually control a single thing. They merely advise. They recommend. They possess exactly as much power as the trust explicitly grants them. And the trust has exactly one general counsel, one single voice, one final decision maker who can legally override every single vote, every corporate sale, and every unauthorized transfer of ownership. Bernice Caldwell. She has been my trusted attorney for 37 years. She is the brilliant woman who originally drafted those ironclad trust documents in 1993 with legal language so tight you would need a high-powered microscope to ever find a loophole, and there simply weren't any to be found. Keith thought he was selling the company. Keith thought wrong. I stood up from my chair. I walked slowly over to the window. I watched a massive cargo plane descend gracefully toward Hobby Airport, its large belly heavy with freight that would eventually pass through the very warehouses my company had constructed. Houston was fully waking up now. The sprawling city I had helped build was moving steadily forward, completely oblivious to the intense small family war that was about to violently unfold in its corporate conference rooms and legal courtrooms. My morning coffee was completely cold. I set the empty ceramic cup down, then I stood up straight and walked back to the kitchen counter. I deliberately made myself a second cup of coffee, something I hadn't done in over 20 years, because today was going to be a very long day, and I had been waiting patiently for it for a very long time. The second cup of coffee tasted entirely different. It was not a matter of the beverage itself. I used the exact same dark beans, brewed it to the same scalding temperature, and poured it into the very same heavy ceramic mug. but rather the profound weight of what that second cup represented. I had not prepared two separate cups of coffee in the span of a single morning since the day Joan died. For 11 years, one solitary cup had always been more than enough for me. One quiet ritual, one brief, uninterrupted moment of absolute stillness, before the massive roaring machinery of the workday began its relentless turning. But this was by no means a normal day. To truly understand why I was not consumed with blinding anger, to comprehend why I could sit there so calmly and finish my coffee while my own flesh and blood systematically dismantled my life's work, you must understand exactly what I built and precisely how long I have been preparing for someone to come along and try to wrest it away from me. I broke ground on my very first construction site back in 1975. I was just 25 years old at the time, a young man standing in thick gray mud up to my ankles on a raw commercial plot just outside the Houston city limits that would eventually, through months of backbreaking labor, become a thriving shopping complex. I possessed absolutely no capital. I had no prestigious MBA hanging on a wall. There was no family money waiting safely in some generational trust fund to catch me if I stumbled and fell. What I did have was a hard-earned civil engineering degree from Texas A&M University, a battered 10-year-old pickup truck, and an unyielding willingness to work punishing 16-hour days in an oppressive August humidity that could easily kill a man if he grew careless for even a moment. Joan used to tell me that I always thought 6 steps ahead of everyone else and simply never told a soul what I was planning. She originally meant it as a sharp complaint. Back then, we had been married for only 5 years at that point, and she was still gradually learning that I never bothered to explain my grand plans until they were already fully in motion. But as the decades rolled on, that observation turned out to be the greatest compliment of my life. Because while all the other local contractors were desperately chasing the next flashy short-term contract, I was quietly building deep corporate relationships that would last for decades. While they were heavily leveraging themselves into catastrophic bankruptcy during the brutal oil crash of the 1980s, I was methodically diversifying my assets into critical infrastructure energy systems and high-stakes precision manufacturing. 48 years. This empire was not inherited through privilege. It was not stumbled upon by luck. It was meticulously built. Joan understood that fundamental truth far better than anyone else alive. She had been standing right there by my side in 1975 when we had a meager $73 left in our joint checking account and a newborn son sleeping soundly in a second-hand wooden crib. She had been right there in 1981 when I signed for the high-risk $100,000 loan that could have easily destroyed our entire future, using every penny of it to open the very first Gallagher precision plant. She had been right there in 1993 when the company proudly crossed the milestone of $50 million in annual revenue, and I made the cold calculating legal decision that would ultimately save the entire empire 30 years down the line. She passed away 4 years ago. It was pancreatic cancer diagnosed far too late, and she was gone far too fast. But even now, before every single major decision I make, I can still hear her clear voice echoing in my mind, asking me if I have truly thought the entire matter all the way through to its logical conclusion. "You've planned for absolutely everything, haven't you, Vernon?" she had softly asked me once near the very end, when the heavy doses of hospital morphine finally made her entirely blunt. "Not everything, Joey," I had answered honestly, "just the things that actually matter." She had smiled weakly at that response. She squeezed my hand with what little physical strength she had left in her frail body. "Vernon Gallagher, you are without a doubt the most calculating man I have ever loved. What is the true difference between building an empire with your own bare hands and merely inheriting one? It is 48 years of relentless sacrifice and every single faded scar earned on your hands." Keith never comprehended that distinction. He officially joined the ranks of the company in 2005, fresh out of his master's program, with a pristine MBA completely full of grandiose ideas about corporate synergies, market positioning, and fluid strategic pivots. I allowed him the room to learn. I assigned him major projects. I watched him succeed at some tasks and fail spectacularly at others. I eventually promoted him to the position of executive vice president in 2015 because he had genuinely earned it, not simply because of the last name printed on his birth certificate, but because he had actually put in the necessary work. But something fundamentally changed within him 3 years ago. Colleen walked directly into his life. In early 2020, and within 6 months of her arrival, Keith began speaking in an entirely different manner. His language became noticeably more corporate, more heavily rehearsed. Casual family dinners that used to be centered around life catching up and shared laughter suddenly turned into cold, calculated strategic succession planning sessions. I remember Thanksgiving in 2021 vividly. Keith abruptly set down his silver fork halfway through the holiday dinner, looked across the table, and said, "Dad, we really should start talking about succession planning, long-term strategic transitions for the leadership." I had looked at him intently across the table. "Should we? The company requires modern, forward-thinking leadership," Colleen had smoothly added from right beside him, her voice sounding as polished and cold as a sheet of glass. "You've earned this next step, Keith." I chose to say absolutely nothing. I just nodded slowly. I finished my meal in silence. But later that exact night, I opened a secret black leather notebook I kept hidden in the back of my desk drawer. It was the expensive kind with a silk ribbon bookmark and heavy pages that did not tear easily. I penned the exact date, November 25th, 2021, and directly underneath it, I wrote Entry 23. Keith used the exact phrase, strategic transitions, at Thanksgiving dinner. Colleen clearly prompted the statement. He didn't disagree. Rust does not announce its arrival with a loud bang. It just silently takes what it wants. I meticulously documented every single interaction over the next 3 years. 47 distinct entries in total, each one precisely dated, each one incredibly specific. I noted the subtle, chilling shift in how Keith addressed me during board meetings, less like a son and more like an aggressive subordinate, openly challenging a superior. I recorded the exact way Colleen's private suggestions would magically appear in his corporate presentations, just a week later, reproduced word for word. I noted the private equity consultants who suddenly started showing up uninvited at company charity events, always hovering near Keith, always leaving with his personal business card in their pockets. I watched my own son slowly transform into someone I no longer recognized. Someone who viewed his own aging father as a mere obstacle to be removed, instead of the man who had built the very kingdom he was trying so desperately to inherit. But through it all, I never confronted him. I didn't argue, I didn't fight. I just quietly wrote it all down. Entry 31, Entry 38, Entry 45. The very night before Keith called me Sunday, November 12th, 2023. I sat in my home office with that black notebook flipped open to a fresh blank page. I could feel the betrayal coming. It was the exact way you can feel a violent storm building pressure deep inside your chest, hours before the first heavy drops of rain actually fall. Keith had been completely distant for weeks. Colleen had been smiling far more than usual. I picked up my fountain pen. I wrote the date. Then I wrote 3 final words. Entry 47, it is time. I kept that notebook in the exact same locked drawer as the private legal file Joan never knew existed. The one I had carefully prepared 30 years ago, on the exact day the company grew large enough that simple family loyalty could no longer be blindly assumed. That notebook contained 47 damning entries, documenting exactly how my son had rotted from the inside out. But that file, that specific file, contained something Keith had absolutely no idea existed. Something I had deliberately built in 1993 to ensure that what I created could never be stolen, even by blood. I opened the wall safe 30 minutes after Keith hung up. Not out of panic, but because after 30 years of preparation, it was finally time to retrieve the file that would end his betrayal before it began. The safe sat behind a framed photograph of the 1981 plant, opening the one where Keith stood beside me in a hard hat, 3 sizes too big, grinning like he'd built the place himself. You had to remove the frame press, the release latch, hidden in the crown molding, and swing the whole panel outward. I'd installed it myself in 1994, the year after I created what was inside. The dossier was exactly where I'd left it. Weathered brown leather, brass corners dulled with age, tied shut with a black ribbon that had gone gray over 3 decades. I carried it to my desk, set it under the green banker's lamp Joan gave me in 1987, and untied the ribbon. The first page was a title sheet typed on a manual typewriter, because in 1993, I didn't trust computers with something this important. The Gallagher Legacy Trust, established November 8th, 1993. General Counsel Bernice Caldwell, Esquire. I turned the page. 64 pages of legal language followed, drafted with the precision of a woman who understood that every word mattered when you were building a fortress designed to last generations. Bernice Caldwell had been 40 years old in 1993, fresh into her role as my general counsel after spending a decade at a Milwaukee corporate firm that billed by the minute and taught her to write contracts that couldn't be broken. She'd sat across from me in that Milwaukee law office 30 years ago, reading glasses perched on her nose, fountain pen in hand. "This is unusual, Vernon," she'd said. "Most founders wait until succession disputes arise." "I'm not waiting for a dispute, Bernice," I told her. "I'm preventing one." She'd studied me for a long moment. Then she'd nodded and started writing. The trust was simple in concept, Byzantine in execution. It held 72% of all voting shares in Gallagher Precision Manufacturing. Not through direct ownership that would have triggered disclosure requirements, but through a series of irrevocable transfers and beneficial interests that made the trust the ultimate controlling authority over every major corporate decision. The board of directors could meet. They could vote. They could recommend. But the trust could veto. The CEO could propose a sale, a merger, a restructuring, but the trust could refuse. And if the CEO or board acted against the trust's interests, say by attempting to sell the company to a private equity firm without authorization, the trust had the power to terminate the CEO immediately and replace the entire board within 30 days. People call it paranoia when you plan for betrayal. They call it genius when it saves you. I'd created the trust in 1993. For one reason, the company had just crossed $50 million in annual revenue, and I'd watched enough empires fall to hostile children to know that blood doesn't guarantee loyalty when there's enough money on the table. Keith had been 12 years old. He was in 7th grade playing baseball, worried about algebra tests and whether Sarah Morrison liked him back. He had no idea his father was building a legal fortress that would someday stop him from destroying everything I'd built. The trust was renewed every 10 years. Delaware General Corporation Law Section 218 required it. Bernice had handled each renewal personally. 1993, 2003, 2013, and most recently 2022. I flipped to the final pages and found the renewal certificate dated October 17th, 2022, just 13 months ago. Bernice's signature in blue ink, my signature below it, 2 witnesses from her firm, a Delaware notary seal embossed so deeply you could feel the ridges with your fingertips. "You want to renew this again?" Bernice had asked me that day, sitting in the same office where we'd created it 3 decades earlier. She was 70 now, white-haired and sharp as the day I met her. "The company's stable, Vernon. Keith's doing well. Do you really need—" "Stable empires fall the fastest." I'd interrupted. "Renew it." She had. Now, sitting in my study with the file open before me, I understood what I'd known in my bones 13 months ago. Keith's betrayal had been coming. The markers had been there, the language shifts, the corporate consultants, Colleen's influence. I'd seen the rot starting, and I'd renewed the legal fortress that would stop it. Not because I wanted to use it, because I'd known I'd have to. The trust's power wasn't just theoretical. Page 47 outlined the enforcement mechanism upon discovery of unauthorized corporate action by the CEO or board, the general counsel of the trust. Bernice could invoke immediate cease and desist authority. Any pending transaction would be void. Any signed contracts would be unenforceable under Delaware law due to lack of proper authorization. Keith thought he was selling the company. Keith was selling air. Because the entity he thought he controlled, Gallagher Precision Manufacturing, Inc., was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Gallagher Legacy Trust. The board he thought answered to him answered to Bernice. The shares he thought gave him authority were non-voting common stock worthless for corporate governance. He'd never looked at the corporate charter closely enough to see it. Why would he? He was the CEO's son, the executive vice president, the heir apparent. They couldn't see it. That was the point. I closed the file, retied the ribbon, set it on my desk under the lamp. 30 years ago, when the company had become valuable enough to attract predators, even predators from within my own family, I'd made a choice. I could trust that love and loyalty would protect what I'd built. Or I could build protection that didn't require trust. I'd chosen the latter. Joan never knew about the trust. I'd kept it from her deliberately, not out of dishonesty, but out of mercy. She'd always believed in Keith's goodness more than I had. She'd wanted to believe he'd grow into the company naturally, earn it through character rather than inheritance. I'd wanted to believe that too, but I'd built the trust anyway. Now, 3 decades later, my son was about to walk straight into a wall he couldn't see, and he'd brought his corporate lawyers, his buyer, and his wife's ambitions with him. Every step he took toward that sale was a step toward that legal impossibility. Every document he signed was worthless. Every promise he made to Apex Industries was a promise he had no authority to keep. I placed the dossier on my desk under the lamp. 30 years ago, I built a wall they couldn't see. Today, Keith was about to walk straight into it. The trust gave me the weapon. Now I needed the strategy. I made one phone call, not to a lawyer, not to the board, but to the one man who'd been waiting 40 years to watch me use something like this. Floyd Reyes answered on the first ring. He always did when I called from the encrypted line. Vernon. Floyd, it's time. A pause. 2 seconds. Maybe 3. Floyd Reyes was 67 years old, retired 3 years ago. After 14 years as a federal judge in the Southern District of Texas. We'd known each other for 40 years, met on a construction site in 1983 when he was a prosecutor, and I was building a courthouse. Over 4 decades, we'd learned to speak in sentences most men needed paragraphs to convey. Keith, he asked, this morning, 8:17. The sale, Apex Industries, he wants me out of the office by Monday. Another pause. I heard Floyd exhale slowly. Not surprise, not shock, just the sound of a man confirming what he'd suspected was coming. How far do you want to let it go, Vernon? That was the question, wasn't it? I could stop Keith today. One phone call to Bernice, one letter to the board invoking the trust's authority, and the sale would be dead before Keith finished his first meeting with Apex's lawyers. But stopping him wasn't enough. What's the difference between an ally and a friend? An ally helps when you ask. A friend has been waiting for you to ask. All the way to the signing table, I said. Floyd was quiet for 5 seconds. Then I understand. He did. That was the thing about Floyd. He understood consequences at a level most people never reached. 14 years on the federal bench teaches you that justice delayed is often justice magnified. Let a man walk far enough down the wrong road, and he'll arrive at a destination he can't escape from. I'll be at the board meeting Thursday, Floyd said. Good. We hung up without goodbyes. We never did. I set the phone down and looked out the window at Houston's morning skyline. Somewhere out there, Keith was probably in his corner office at headquarters, calling Apex's acquisition team, telling them the deal was moving forward, that his father had accepted the inevitable. He had no idea what inevitable actually meant, but I did. Because I had been watching inevitability build for 18 months, ever since a woman walked into my son's life and started asking questions designed to sound like concern. May 2022, 18 months before Keith's phone call. Keith and Colleen had invited me to their estate for a private dinner. Just the 3 of us, which should have been my first warning. Their house was everything mine wasn't: modern minimalist, all glass walls and floating staircases that looked like they belonged in an architecture magazine. Colleen had decorated it herself, she'd told me. Every detail intentional. She was 35, then 3 years into the marriage, and already reshaping Keith into someone who used words like optimization and strategic realignment in casual conversation. We'd finished the main course, some kind of fish I didn't recognize, prepared by a private chef who'd left before we sat down when Colleen set down her wine glass and looked at Keith with the kind of expression that pretended to be spontaneous but had been rehearsed in a mirror. Keith, she said, when was the last time your father actually ran this company? Be honest. Keith had hesitated, looked at me, then back at her. He still oversees. Overseas, she'd interrupted gently. Not runs. I'd said nothing, just cut another piece of fish and waited. The company needs modern leadership. Colleen had continued, her voice soft but surgical. You've earned this, Keith. You've worked for it your entire life. You deserve to lead without someone looking over your shoulder. Keith had been quiet for a long moment. Then, barely audible, he'd never agree. Colleen had smiled, reached across the table and touched his hand. Then don't ask. I'd watched the whole thing happen in real time. Watched my son's face shift from uncertainty to consideration to something that looked like resolve. Watched Colleen guide him toward a conclusion she'd already drawn for him. And I'd finished my fish and thanked them for a lovely dinner and driven home without saying a word about what I'd just witnessed, because I wanted to see how far it would go. Over the next 18 months, I documented everything. The consultant she hired to value the company paid with Keith's corporate card. The corrupt physician, she found a doctor with gambling debts who'd forge a dementia diagnosis for $50,000 cash. The private equity firms whose representatives started appearing at company events, always standing near Keith, always leaving with his business card. Colleen had done her research. Wharton, MBA, top of her class, sharp enough to map every structural vulnerability in a corporate hierarchy. She'd studied the bylaws, identified the board members who'd side with Keith, calculated exactly how much Apex would pay and how quickly they'd close. She was brilliant, she was thorough, she was wrong, because what Colleen didn't know, what Keith didn't know, was that I'd researched her long before she'd researched me. Meridian Capital, her previous employer, the financial fraud investigation that had quietly closed in 2019 without formal charges, but with enough smoke to end her career at a major firm. I'd known about it before Keith brought her to Sunday dinner to meet the family. I'd known about the investigator's report, the suspicious wire transfers, the clients who'd lost money while she'd somehow come out ahead. I'd known, and I'd said nothing, because I wanted to see if Keith would notice, if he'd ask the right questions, if he'd see the fraud sitting across from him at dinner every night. He hadn't, so I'd watched, documented, waited. Colleen had researched the corporate bylaws with her Wharton precision mapping, every structural vulnerability, constructing her coup like a thesis defense. She'd read every page of the corporate charter, studied every board resolution from the past decade, identified every legal pathway to force a sale. She had researched the bylaws, or so she thought. What she'd missed was embedded 30 years before she was born, written in language so precise that even a Wharton MBA wouldn't find it unless she knew exactly what to look for. The Gallagher Legacy Trust wasn't in the bylaws. It was above them, outside them, surrounding them like a fortress wall that didn't appear on any map Keith or Colleen had ever seen. But before I could watch Colleen discover her error, I needed to see what Keith had already done. So Tuesday morning, I drove to headquarters. The office was empty, not cleared for cleaning, not temporarily relocated, stripped with the deliberate precision of a man erasing another man from existence. I stood in the doorway of what had been my executive suite for 32 years. Top floor, southwest corner windows, overlooking the original plant I'd built in 1981. Every book was gone, every file, every photograph. The walls showed rectangular shadows, where frames had hung lighter patches of paint, marking decades of accumulated memories, now hauled away in boxes I'd never see again. The desk was gone, the credenza, the leather couch Joan had picked out in 1991 because she said every office needed somewhere a man could think without sitting at attention. All of it, gone. What remained, one leather chair centered in the empty room like a throne in an abandoned castle. And silence so complete I could hear the building's ventilation system humming through the walls. I walked to the chair, sat down, looked out at Houston's skyline. 48 years in this building, Keith had cleared it in one phone call. Efficiency, I supposed. His mother would have had something to say about that. Joan never believed efficiency and wisdom were the same thing. But sitting there in that hollow room, I felt something Keith probably expected would be rage or grief. Instead, I felt clarity. An empty office isn't an insult, it's a confession. They'd cleaned it out. Good. Now I knew exactly what I was dealing with. This wasn't a corporate restructuring. This wasn't strategic transition. This was erasure. Keith wanted me gone so completely that even the walls wouldn't remember I'd been here, which meant he was more frightened than I'd thought. I stood up, started to leave, then caught sight of something near the window. A small object partially hidden behind where the credenza used to stand. I walked over, bent down. A miniature hard hat, yellow plastic, sized for a child with Gallagher precision, stenciled across the front in letters that had faded to gray. Keith's, age 8, his first job site visit back when he'd thought construction work was heroic and his father was invincible. The hat had lived on my credenza for 34 years. Somehow, in their rush to erase me, they'd left it behind. I picked it up, felt the lightweight plastic still sturdy after all these years, turned it over in my hands. Age 8, I said to the empty room. First job site. He thought the hard hat was too heavy. Now he thinks the company's too light to hold. I slipped it into my coat pocket and walked out. The empty office was Keith's message to me. The hard hat was mine to him. He just didn't know it yet. But the office wasn't the only weapon they'd built. Colleen had been more thorough than that. September 2023, 2 months before Keith's call, a boutique medical clinic on Houston's outskirts. The kind of place where privacy costs extra and late evening appointments don't appear on public schedules. Dr. Gerald Hoffman sat in his consultation room at 8:30 p.m., watching Colleen count $50,000 in cash onto his desk in neat stacks of hundreds. Dr. Hoffman was 58, a physician with decent credentials and catastrophic judgment, specifically a $400,000 gambling debt to people who didn't accept payment plans. He'd been desperate enough that when Colleen had called requesting a confidential consultation, he'd said yes before asking what it was about. Now he knew. I need documentation, Colleen said, her voice calm and businesslike, like she was ordering office supplies. Mild cognitive decline. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to raise fiduciary questions at a board level. Dr. Hoffman stared at the cash, then at her. This could cost me my license. Only if someone finds out, Colleen replied. Here's 50,000 reasons they won't. He'd taken the money, forged the neurological assessment, used my name, my date of birth, diagnostic language, careful enough to sound clinical, but vague enough to weaponize. Mild cognitive decline, impaired executive function, recommendation for immediate family oversight of major financial decisions. It was a masterpiece of medical fraud, and I'd known about it exactly 3 weeks after he signed it. Bernice had gotten a call from Dr. Holly Finch, my actual neurologist, 55 years old, precise as a surgeon, and the woman who'd been monitoring my cognitive health for 8 years as part of routine executive physicals. Holly had been alerted by a colleague who'd seen Hoffman's signature on a document that didn't match his usual patient base. Someone's created a fraudulent neurological assessment using your name, Holly had told Bernice over a secured line. I've never diagnosed Vernon with anything remotely resembling cognitive decline. His last assessment was 3 months ago, perfect cognitive function reaction times, better than most 50-year-olds. Keep his real records secure, Holly, Bernice had said. We're going to need them. When Bernice told me, I'd asked one question. Do we have proof Colleen paid for it? Working on it, she'd said. Good, don't stop the document. Let them use it. Bernice had paused. Vernon, healthcare fraud, I'd said. Federal crime. Colleen thinks she's building leverage. She's building her own indictment. Healthcare fraud isn't corporate strategy. It's a federal felony with a 10-year maximum sentence. They'd built a weapon against me. A fraudulent diagnosis. A corrupt physician's signature. A carefully constructed narrative of incapacity, designed to make the board question whether I was fit to resist their sale. I'd let them keep it. Let them present it to the board. Let them whisper about my declining health in conference rooms and corporate hallways. Let them believe it was working. Because the moment they used it in front of witnesses, it stopped being leverage and became evidence. Every time Keith mentioned my health concerns in a meeting, he was creating a paper trail. Every time Colleen suggested my cognitive decline to a board member, she was adding another witness to her eventual prosecution. Every time that forged diagnosis got passed across the table, it moved closer to becoming Exhibit A in a federal case. They built a weapon against me. I let them keep it until I could use it against them. And Keith, predictably, was just getting started with the people who actually ran the numbers. Keith called Terrence into his office 3 weeks after declaring war on me, and I knew exactly what he was about to do, because men like my son always think leverage starts with threats instead of trust. Terrence Callahan was 45 years old, our CFO for 12 years, and the kind of man who wore the same watch his father had given him when he graduated from Texas. A&M with a degree in accounting that he'd earned with night classes while working full-time at a manufacturing plant. He was loyal to the institution rather than the executive. That distinction, that specific moral hierarchy would save everything when Keith forced him to choose between his job and his conscience. The meeting happened behind Keith's soundproof doors. I wasn't there, but Terrence told Bernice everything 3 days later, and Bernice told me. I need your signature on the master financial authorization, Terrence, Keith had said, sliding a stack of documents across his desk. Today. Terrence had taken his time reading. He always did. That's what made him a good CFO. He read the fine print before other people finished the cover page. After 5 minutes of silence, he'd looked up. Keith, some of these asset declarations, they're deliberately obscured. The voting structure isn't... Sign it, Keith had interrupted, or I'll have someone at your desk Monday who will. Terrence had sat very still. I imagined him running the calculation in his head. Mortgaged 2 kids and college wife who'd left her career to raise them, health insurance, retirement savings 12 years, deep into company vesting schedules. This could expose the company to. I didn't ask for analysis. Keith had said, his voice cold, in a way I'd never taught him. I asked for your signature. Terrence had signed. That should have been the end of it. Keith walked away, thinking he'd secured his CFO's complicity. Thought loyalty could be purchased with fear. Thought a man's mortgage was bigger than his integrity. He was wrong. 3 nights later, at 11:40 p.m., Terrence sat at his kitchen table with his laptop and composed an encrypted email to Bernice Caldwell. Subject line, protocol breach, urgent. Body 4 paragraphs, outlining every fraudulent disclosure he'd been forced to sign, every asset deliberately obscured, every structural misrepresentation designed to hide the trust's controlling position from Apex Capital's due diligence. At the bottom, he'd written, 12 years I've never broken protocol, but this isn't protocol anymore. This is fraud, and you need to know. Integrity costs you sleep. Corruption costs you everything else. Bernice forwarded me the email at 6 a.m. the next morning. I read it twice. Then I called her. Don't acknowledge it, I said. Let Terrence think he's alone. He needs to stay scared enough to look compromised. Vernon, trust me. She did. But while Keith was squeezing, the CFO, Floyd, was positioning himself for the masterpiece. Thursday, late November. The board meeting Keith had been building toward for 3 weeks. Floyd requested a private pre-meeting with Keith 15 minutes before the official session. Just the two of them, in the small conference room adjacent to the main boardroom. Keith had agreed immediately. Why wouldn't he? Floyd Reyes was a former federal judge, a man whose word carried weight that money couldn't buy. Floyd told me later what he'd said word for word, because we'd rehearsed it 3 times to get the tone exactly right. Kya? Keith Mamai. Whoa, pate. Floyd had begun settling into his chair with the deliberate patience of a man who'd spent 14 years on the bench. I've been thinking about your father's situation, about the company's future. Keith had leaned forward, eager, hopeful. I think it's time for the company to move forward, Floyd had continued. I support what you're doing. The relief that had flooded Keith's face, Floyd said, was almost painful to witness. Floyd, that means everything. Thank you. They'd shaken hands. 2 men who understood power, so Keith thought. 20 minutes later, the board convened. 9 members present. Harold Whitmore, the chairman, called the meeting to order. Keith presented his motion grant Executive Vice President Keith Gallagher interim operational authority during the chairman emeritus's medical leave. Floyd had waited for the right moment. Let 2 other members speak first. Then, in his measured judicial tone, the voice that had once sentenced men to federal prison, I move to grant Executive Vice President Keith Gallagher interim operational authority during the chairman emeritus's medical leave. The company requires stable leadership during this transition. The vote carried 6-9. Keith left that boardroom with documentation he believed empowered him to execute the sale. 6 votes, majority control, legal authority to proceed. 30 seconds after adjournment, Floyd sent me a text from the parking garage. He bought it, all of it. I called him from my car. How many? I asked. 3 confirmed before I walked in, Floyd said. I've been working them for 2 weeks. Quiet conversations, private dinners, reminding them who actually built this company and what the trust really means. So Keith has 2, Floyd confirmed. Maybe 3 if Jennifer waffles, but he thinks he has 6. He's going to walk into that signing with Apex believing the board gave him authority to sell. Loyalty, when performed perfectly, is indistinguishable from betrayal. You're a cold man, Floyd, I said. I learned from the best, he replied. We hung up. I sat in my car in the driveway of my River Oaks home and thought about what Keith was feeling right now. The victory, the validation, the belief that he'd finally stepped out from under his father's shadow and claimed what was rightfully his. He had no idea he was standing in a room full of mirrors, mistaking reflections for reality. Keith left that boardroom believing he'd secured institutional support. 6 votes, majority control, legal authority to proceed. 3 out of 9 votes were already mine. Keith just didn't know it yet. But Keith's hollow board victory was just the opening act. The real performance, the one that would trap them both, was about to begin. The buyer arrived on a Tuesday in early November, and I knew before Dwight Irvine shook Keith's hand that my son was about to lie to one of the sharpest acquisition minds in private equity, and Irvine would know it before he left the building. Dwight Irvine was 52 years old, CEO of Apex Capital Partners, and he'd built his reputation over 30 years on finding structural problems other buyers missed. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Keith's monthly salary, and he asked questions like a prosecutor who already knew the answers, but wanted to hear you lie about them anyway. The meeting happened in Keith's executive office, the same one that used to be on the floor below mine before Keith had quietly moved himself up after clearing me out. Colleen sat beside him, her posture perfect, her smile calculated to project confidence without arrogance. I wasn't there, but Bernice had positioned a consultant in the meeting under the guise of technical support. We had every word. Walk me through the voting structure, Irvin had said, leaning back in his chair with the casual authority of a man who controlled billions. Who holds decision-making authority at the equity level? Keith had delivered his rehearsed corporate tone without hesitation. The board maintains distributed governance across key stakeholders. Standard Delaware corporate architecture. Irvine's eyes had narrowed slightly. Distributed how specifically? Through delegated authority structures that ensure operational continuity while maintaining fiduciary oversight. Keith had said, which was the kind of sentence that sounded impressive until you realized it meant absolutely nothing. And the chairman emeritus, your father, what's his voting position post-transition? He stepped back from operational oversight due to documented health considerations, Keith had answered smoothly. The board has granted me interim authority. Interim authority to execute asset sales. Full operational discretion, Keith had said, and I imagine him sitting a little straighter proud of how well he was performing. What's the difference between confidence and competence? Competence knows when to stop talking. Irvine had nodded, asked a few more questions about revenue projections and facility utilization, shaken Keith's hand, told him Apex was prepared to advance to formal due diligence. 3 minutes after leaving the building, Irvin had called his chief legal counsel from his car. Run a full title search on Gallagher Infrastructure's voting structure, Matt Smotarp, he'd said. Corporate registry, trust filings, everything. Something doesn't feel right about that presentation. Because Irvine was competent, and competent people recognize corporate jargon as the sound of a man hiding something he doesn't understand. But if Keith's meeting with Irvine was dangerous, what Colleen did 2 weeks later was catastrophic. Mid-November, an elite private lending firm on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in Houston's financial district. The kind of place where the receptionist asked for your net worth before offering you coffee. Colleen met with Stuart Langley, managing partner in an office with mahogany furniture that had probably been imported from somewhere with a royal family. Langley specialized in high-risk bridge loans to executives with imminent liquidity, events the kind of lending that made normal bankers nervous, but made men like Langley very, very rich. Bernice got the details 3 weeks later when Langley's firm started circulating verification requests that triggered alerts in our legal monitoring system. By then, Colleen had already committed federal bank fraud. The acquisition has received unanimous board approval. Colleen had told Langley, sitting across that mahogany desk, like she was discussing stock options instead of lying to a financial institution. All regulatory clearances are in place. I need bridge financing while the institutional wire transfers process standard private equity timeline friction. Collateral basis, Langley had asked, secured against anticipated proceeds. 420 million transaction closes December 15th. Langley had studied her for a moment. Colleen, I imagine, had held his gaze without flinching. Wharton, MBA, top of her class, convinced that intelligence and preparation were the same as honesty. 8 million at 18% annualized, Langley had said, secured against verified board resolutions and transaction documents. Colleen had signed the affidavits without hesitation, binding legal statements affirming that the transaction was unanimously board approved and legally cleared for execution. Every word a lie. Every signature a federal felony. You understand the material adverse change clause triggers immediate full recall, Langley had asked. There won't be any changes, Colleen had replied, her smile cold and certain. This deal is locked. Federal bank fraud. 10 years maximum sentence. No parole for white-collar felonies. Within hours of receiving that $8 million, Colleen had wired $2.3 million as a non-refundable deposit on a coastal estate in Galveston. $800,000 on a luxury yacht she'd been eyeing for 2 years. Reserved an exclusive Houston restaurant buyout for December 15th. To celebrate the closing, another $18,000 paid in full, non-refundable. She'd also locked in that 18% interest rate, 18% annualized on $8 million. I'd done the math the moment Bernice told me. 18% of 8 million is 1.44 million per year. Divide that by 365 days. $3,945 every single day. Every morning Colleen woke up, she owed $3,945 more than she had the night before. Every weekend, every holiday, every delay in closing that transaction drained her deeper into a financial hole she couldn't climb out of without that sale completing exactly as planned. And she couldn't repay the loan early. Langley's contracts didn't allow it. That's how he made his real money. Lock them in, let the interest compound, make sure they stayed desperate enough to close whatever deal had made them desperate in the first place. Colleen left that lender's office with $8 million and a financial death sentence. Every day of delay before December 15th cost her $3,945. In interest money she couldn't recover, couldn't negotiate, couldn't escape. The clock was ticking, and I was about to make sure it ran all the way down. But Colleen's desperation was about to create an opportunity I hadn't planned for, one that would come from the most unexpected witness in my family. Eloise was invited to the house for paperwork, routine scholarship renewals. Nothing unusual, and she had no idea that 20 minutes in her father's living room would hand me a weapon I'd never planned for, but would never hesitate to use. Eloise Gallagher was 19 years old. Keith's daughter from his first marriage and the divorce 8 years ago had drawn clear lines in our family. Keith got the modern estate and the new wife. Eloise got Sunday dinners at my house and a grandfather who actually answered when she called. She'd been closer to me than to her father since she was 11. That's what happens when a man chooses ambition over his daughter's school plays, chooses business trips over her birthday dinners, chooses a Wharton MBA over the child who needed him to just be there. Thursday afternoon, Keith had called her. "Eloise, can you swing by Saturday afternoon?" he had said. "Scholarship renewal paperwork just needs your signature. 20 minutes tops." "Sure, Dad," she'd said. "What time?" 2 o'clock, thanks, sweetheart." She told me about it later after everything. Told me she'd almost said no. She had a study group that afternoon, and Keith had missed her last 3 birthday calls. But she'd gone anyway because he was still her father, and 19-year-olds still hoped their parents might change. Saturday afternoon, 2 p.m. exactly. Eloise sat in Keith's living room. The house was all glass walls and vaulted ceilings, the kind of architecture designed to make visitors feel small. Keith had gone upstairs to his study to retrieve the documents. Told her to wait, he'd be right back. The living room opened directly into the kitchen. That open concept design Colleen had insisted on, where every conversation bled into every other space whether you wanted it to or not. Keith and Colleen had started talking in that kitchen. Their voices carried perfectly across the 20 feet of polished concrete floor. They thought Eloise had stepped outside to her car. She'd mentioned checking her parking. She was in a loading zone. They must have assumed she'd actually gone. She hadn't. She was sitting on their white leather couch phone in her lap, about to text her study group that she'd be late. Then she heard Colleen's voice sharp and clear. "The moment the apex wires clear December 15th, we check him into Sunrise. Full intake premium suite, $18,000 a month. The old man won't know what hit him." Eloise had frozen. "What about his personal accounts?" Keith had asked, his voice carrying that hesitant tone he used when he knew something was wrong, but wanted permission to do it anyway. "The house. That's why we move fast," Colleen had said. "Conservatorship petition filed, same day total control. We'll have legal authority over every asset, every account, every decision. He'll be eating pudding cups in a memory care unit while we're closing escrow on River Oaks real estate. Children see what adults think they've hidden, and sometimes they record it." Eloise had lifted her phone with hands that were starting to shake. Opened the audio recorder app, hit the red button, set the phone face down on the couch beside her, and stayed absolutely still. 4 minutes and 23 seconds. That's how long they talked. Keith asking questions about timing, about legal procedures, about what would happen if I resisted. Colleen answering with the cold precision of someone who'd researched every step, every form, every legal avenue to erase a man from his own life. "What if he fights it?" Keith had asked. "He won't," Colleen had said. "That's what the medical documentation is for. We show the court Dr. Hoffman's assessment. Cognitive decline, impaired judgment, danger to himself. Sunrise has a memory care lockdown wing. He'll be there before he even realizes what's happening." Eloise had sat on that couch, silent and invisible, recording every word. When Keith finally came back downstairs with the scholarship paperwork, she'd signed it with a hand that barely worked, thanked him, walked to her car like nothing had happened. Then she'd driven to the far edge of the neighborhood, parked under a street lamp, and sat there with her hands shaking too hard to put the car in drive. She told me later she'd played the recording 3 times before she had the courage to send it. Each replay made it worse. Each time she heard her father's voice agreeing to institutionalize his own father, it became more real. Saturday evening, 6:43 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Eloise. "Grandpa, I don't know if this matters, but I think you should hear it. Attached audio, file 423 duration." I was in my study, the same room where I'd opened the trust documents, where I'd made the call to Floyd, where I'd planned every move of this chess game for 3 weeks. I pressed play. Colleen's voice came through first, crystal clear. "The old man won't know what hit him." Then Keith, my son, asking about conservatorship procedures like he was discussing a corporate restructuring instead of erasing his father from existence. I listened to the whole thing, 4 minutes and 23 seconds. Then I played it again, and again, 4 minutes, 23 seconds. That's all it took to end forgiveness. Up until that moment, up until I heard my son's voice agreeing to lock me in a memory care unit, while they liquidated everything I'd built, I'd still held a small reservation of mercy. The plan had been to stop them, expose them, let them face consequences. But I'd still thought somewhere deep in the part of me that remembered Keith at 8 years old, in that hard hat, that maybe there was a version of this where he could learn, grow, become something better than what Colleen had shaped him into. That reservation died. I texted Eloise back immediately. "It matters. Are you okay?" Her reply came 30 seconds later. "Yes, good. Don't tell anyone. And thank you, sweetheart." I saved the audio file, backed it up to 3 separate encrypted drives, sent a copy to Bernice with a single line of instruction: "Add this to the December 15th presentation." I listened to that recording 3 times in my study that Saturday night. 4 minutes and 23 seconds of my son and his wife planning to institutionalize me, seize my assets, and erase me from my own life the moment their fraudulent sale cleared. The recording erased any remaining mercy from my strategy. And Keith, with the precision of a man who didn't understand the difference between strategy and felony, was making it easier every day. The email arrived Tuesday morning in Bernice's encrypted inbox, and the moment I read Keith's attorney offering her $2 million to ensure the deal closed smoothly, I knew my son had just committed another felony he didn't understand. 3rd week of November, Tuesday, 9:17 a.m. Bernice called me at 9:23. "Vernon," she said, her voice carrying that careful neutrality she used when something was either very good or very bad. "I need you to see something. I'm sending it over now." "Email?" "No, I'm bringing it myself." She arrived at my study 40 minutes later with a manila envelope and the kind of expression that made me stand up before she'd even crossed the threshold. Inside the envelope, a single printed page. I read it twice. "Ms. Blanchard, we represent Keith Gallagher in the forthcoming Apex Capital transaction. We propose a $2 million consulting retainer to ensure structural continuity and expedited governance approvals. Confidential engagement, wire transfer upon closing. Philip Hargrove, Senior Partner, Hargrove and Associates Corporate Law. $2 million. To my General Counsel, to ensure the deal proceeded without structural delays or governance complications." Philip Hargrove was a senior partner at one of Houston's white shoe corporate law firms, the kind of place where they billed by the minute and thought ethics were something you discussed at bar association dinners. He'd represented Keith on the Apex deal from the beginning, and apparently he'd convinced himself that offering my lawyer $2 million in hush money was sophisticated legal maneuvering. It wasn't. It was corporate bribery, federal felony, 5 years maximum sentence, mandatory restitution. "They're getting desperate, Bernice," I said, setting the page down on my desk. "Desperate people make mistakes." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small flash drive. "They already made the biggest one when they sent this email," she said. "Corporate bribery, breach of fiduciary duty. I've secured 6 copies across 3 jurisdictions, encrypted servers, physical safe deposits, offshore backup, time-stamped, digitally signed. Philip Hargrove might as well have written a confession." I looked at the email again. Keith thought he was buying cooperation. What he'd actually bought was a federal indictment with a digital signature and a timestamp that would survive every lawyer he could afford. "You didn't respond?" I asked. "Not a word," Bernice said. "I want him wondering. Wondering means he'll make another mistake. Corporate bribery, federal felony, 5 years, maximum mandatory restitution." "Good," I said. "Let it sit. Let them think you're considering it." Let them think they're winning. She nodded, left the envelope on my desk, took the flash drive with her. I sat there for a long time after she'd gone reading that email over and over. My son. My son had hired a lawyer who thought bribing the trust's general counsel was how you closed a deal. Keith had no idea what he was building. Every move he made, every attorney he hired, every dollar he spent, he was constructing his own prosecution. But I had one more piece to position. The most important one, late November. I made the call from my study on a Thursday afternoon when I knew Dwight Irvine would be in his Manhattan office but not in meetings. He answered on the third ring. Dwight Irvine. Dwight, this is Vernon Gallagher. Silence, 3 seconds, maybe 4. Mr. Gallagher, he finally said, and I could hear him sitting up straighter, could hear the shift from casual business to full attention. I wasn't expecting to hear from you directly. I know your due diligence team has flagged structural anomalies in our voting architecture, I said. I want you to proceed with the closing. Do not pull out. Another pause, longer this time. Sir, Irvin said carefully, do you understand what you're asking me to execute? My legal team is recommending we withdraw based on governance red flags. Your son has represented that he has full authority to... I'm asking you to be in that room on December 15th, I interrupted. What you witness there will be well worth your capital, and I'm offering you exclusive first rights to a clean energy partnership that will dwarf this transaction. I heard him exhale slowly. Dwight Irvine hadn't built a private equity empire by missing opportunities, but he also hadn't built it by walking into traps. Mr. Gallagher, he said, in 30 years, I've never seen a founder call a buyer to ask them not to walk away from a deal. You have my attention. Good, I said. Bring your legal team. You'll want witnesses. What's the difference between stopping a crime and orchestrating its exposure witnesses? You're telling me to show up to a closing you know is going to collapse? Irvine said. Not a question, a confirmation. I'm telling you to show up to a closing where you'll see exactly what kind of man tried to sell you a company he didn't own, I replied. And then I'm telling you I'd like to do actual business with you, the kind built on honesty instead of fraud. Clean energy infrastructure, Texas utility partnerships, the work I should have been doing instead of watching my son try to steal from me. Another long pause. I'll be there, Irvine said. December 15th, 6 p.m. Thank you, Dwight. Mr. Gallagher, he said, and there was something in his voice, respect maybe, or curiosity about what a 73-year-old founder had orchestrated. Whatever you're planning, I hope it's worth it. It will be, I said. I promise you that. I hung up, sat back in my chair. The buyer was now a cooperative witness, not an innocent victim. Floyd controlled the board. Bernice held the evidence. Terrence had broken protocol to sound the alarm, and I had Eloise's recording. Every piece was positioned exactly where it needed to be. Now I just needed to let Keith walk all the way to that signing table, let him believe right up until the moment the doors opened that he'd won. But I had one final ally to activate, one who could make sure federal authorities were watching when everything collapsed. The golf course was empty at dawn, nothing but fog rolling across the fairways, and 2 men walking near the 9th green discussing federal wire fraud the way other men discuss their handicaps. Last week of November, 6:15 in the morning, the kind of hour when Houston's exclusive private clubs were deserted, except for groundskeepers and men who needed conversations nobody else would hear. Senator Willard Fulton met me by the 9th green wearing khakis and a windbreaker, looking like any other retired executive, getting his exercise before the day started. He was 68 years old, United States Senator for Texas, and a friend for 20 years. The kind of man who made calls that changed federal investigations without ever appearing in headlines. I'd brought a folder, handed it to him without preamble. Wire fraud, bank fraud, fraudulent misrepresentations to a financial institution regarding board approval status. Active suppression of material corporate governance data to an interstate buyer, both federal crimes. Willard opened the folder, scanned the first page, looked up at me. Your daughter-in-law and my son, I said. He kept reading, took his time. I'd learned years ago that Willard Fulton didn't rush through documents. That's what made him dangerous in committee hearings and valuable as an ally. $8 million secured with fraudulent affidavits, he said after 2 minutes of silence. That's not corporate maneuvering, Vernon. That's a 10-year federal sentence. I know exactly what it is, Willard. He closed the folder, looked out across the fairway where the fog was starting to lift, revealing perfect grass nobody would walk on for another 3 hours. What do you want me to do? FBI, I said. Not SEC, the company's private no securities angle, pure criminal fraud, wire fraud for the interstate Apex transaction, bank fraud for Colleen's loan misrepresentations. Preliminary investigation, full preliminary, I confirmed, but I need them to hold until the closing date, December 15th. Let Keith sign his name to the transaction documents first. Let Colleen stand beside him. Then let federal authorities understand what they witnessed. Willard was quiet for a long moment. You want maximum exposure, he finally said. Not a question. I want consequences that last, I replied. Wire fraud, 20 years, maximum federal sentence. No state-level parole. I'll make some calls, Vernon, Willard said. Give it 2 weeks. The investigation will be active by mid-December. Quiet. No warrants until after your closing date. They'll watch, they'll document, they'll be ready to move the moment you need them to. Thank you. He handed the folder back. We shook hands, started walking back toward the clubhouse like two men who'd just discussed their golf swings. Vernon, he said as we reached the parking lot, I've known you 20 years. I've never seen you go this far. I've never had a reason this good, I said. He nodded, got in his car, drove away. I stood there for a moment, watching the fog clear, completely revealing a perfect morning that looked nothing like what I felt inside. Then I drove home. 2 weeks later, the confirmation packet arrived. Early December, Wednesday afternoon. I was in my study when I heard the mail truck walk to the mailbox, out of habit, pulled out the usual stack of bills and advertisements, and one large manila envelope with a return address I didn't recognize. Sunrise Luxury Senior Living, Houston, Texas. I opened it standing there at the mailbox. Inside intake confirmation forms, medical requirements checklist, monthly billing agreement, and a reservation confirmation for Premium Suite 4C. Patient name Vernon Gallagher. Check-in date December 16th, 2023. Monthly rate $18,000. I read it twice. Then I walked inside to my kitchen, set the packet on the table next to my coffee cup, and stared out the window at my garden for 3 full minutes without moving. Planning your father's imprisonment is theory. Booking the room is execution. They'd already picked the suite. 4C, premium accommodations, high security wing, the kind of place where they locked the doors from the outside and called it memory care. December 16th, one day after they thought the sale would close. One day after they thought $420 million would clear into accounts they controlled. They'd already planned it down to the day. I picked up my phone, called Bernice. She answered on the first ring. Vernon, move up the timeline if you can, I said. My voice came out different, harder than I'd heard it in years, harder than Bernice had probably ever heard it. Vernon, she said carefully, what happened? I looked down at the confirmation packet. They booked the room, I said. December 16th, Sunrise Living. I'm holding the intake confirmation in my hand. Silence on the other end. 5 seconds, maybe more. Understood, Bernice finally said, her voice matching mine. I'll accelerate what I can. We hung up. I sat at my kitchen table with that confirmation packet in front of me and my coffee going cold beside it. The coffee I could no longer taste. The kitchen I'd sat in for 40 years. The house Joan and I had bought when Keith was 3 years old and the company was just starting to turn a profit. Premium Suite 4C. December 16th, 2023. $18,000 per month. They'd picked the room where they planned to erase me. Chosen the date. Locked in the rate. Colleen had made that call. Probably from her car, probably on speakerphone while she drove down some Houston highway, discussing my institutionalization like it was a dinner reservation, and Keith had agreed to it. My son. The boy who'd worn that hard hat at age 8, who'd asked me to teach him how to read blueprints, who'd once told me he wanted to build things just like his dad. That confirmation packet was the point of no return. All mercy eliminated. And while I was hardening my resolve with that confirmation packet on my kitchen table, Floyd was systematically dismantling the foundation Keith didn't know he'd never actually built. Floyd met them one by one in the first week of December. 3 board members Keith believed were neutral. 3 private locations across Houston. 3 conversations that dismantled my son's entire foundation without him knowing a single word had been spoken. First week of December, 10 days before closing. The first meeting happened in a quiet coffee shop in West University. The kind of place where nobody paid attention to 2 men in business casual discussing corporate governance over espresso. Floyd sat across from Robert Vance, a board member who'd served for 8 years and had voted with Keith on the November motion. The transaction is structurally illegal, Floyd had said without preamble. There's a voting trust established 30 years ago with 72% control. Keith doesn't know it exists. There will be federal fraud charges, wire fraud, bank fraud, healthcare fraud. You need to decide where you stand before December 15th. Robert had set down his coffee cup. Floyd, I had no idea. Keith assured us his father approved the succession. Keith doesn't know what his father holds, Floyd had replied. The second meeting happened in a hotel conference room downtown. Jennifer Martinez, board member for 6 years operations background, the kind of person who read every footnote in every quarterly report. Floyd had laid it out in numbers she couldn't ignore. The FBI has been alerted. Colleen secured an $8 million bridge loan using fraudulent affidavits, claiming unanimous board approval. That's federal bank fraud. If you support this transaction, you become a witness to organized corporate fraud. What do you need from me? Jennifer had asked. Opposition vocal December 15th. The third meeting was the quickest. David Thornton, board member for 12 years, former federal prosecutor who'd retired into corporate governance. Floyd had only needed to show him the preliminary FBI investigation documentation. David had read 3 pages and said, I'm out, Keith's on his own. What's the difference between votes and loyalty? Loyalty can be flipped with one conversation. 3 meetings, 3 flips. Keith's 6-vote majority evaporated in 72 hours. Keith believed he commanded 6 of 9 board votes. The reality was he possessed exactly 2 his own allies who were either too loyal or too compromised to abandon him now. Floyd controlled 6 votes for me. The floor had completely vanished beneath my son's feet, and he had no idea he was standing on air. 2 days later, Jennifer Martinez submitted a formal absence request for the December 15th session. Sudden health constraints requiring immediate attention. Keith had called me about it. Actually called me. First time in 3 weeks. Dad, he'd said, his voice carrying a thread of anxiety he was trying to hide. Jennifer Martinez just submitted a health absence for the 15th. That's unfortunate timing. Is it? I'd asked. We still have the majority, he'd said more to himself than to me. We're fine. If you say so, Keith. We'd hung up. He had no idea. The majority he was counting on had been systematically dismantled, vote by vote, conversation by conversation, until all that remained was the performance of authority and the reality of nothing. But Keith's phantom majority wasn't his only illusion. The authority he'd celebrated obtaining was just as empty. Flashback. Mid-November. 3 weeks before the closing Keith was so certain would change everything. The board had convened in the 30th floor conference room, 9 members present. Keith at the head of the table, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He'd presented Dr. Gerald Hoffman's forged diagnosis with the solemnity of a man who believed he was doing something noble instead of something criminal. My father's cognitive decline, documented here by independent neurological assessment, necessitates immediate leadership transition. I move for interim operational authority during his medical leave. Floyd had performed his role perfectly. Seconded. The company requires stable executive continuity. The vote had carried 6-9. Keith had won. Afterward, in the hallway, Keith had cornered his attorney, Blake Sutton, 38 years old, corporate lawyer from a mid-tier Houston firm that specialized in standard mergers. Competent at what he knew, fatally inexperienced in what he didn't. Blake, this gives me full authority to proceed with the Apex transaction, correct? Blake had reviewed the motion language on his tablet, scrolling through the resolution Keith had just won. Interim operational authority covers executive decisions during board-approved medical transitions, Blake had said with the confidence of a man who'd never encountered a voting trust structure. You're clear to proceed. Keith had exhaled relief, flooding his face. Thank you. Authority without power is performance art. What Blake didn't know, what Keith didn't know, was that interim operational authority was a title without teeth. It granted Keith the ability to make operational decisions, hire and fire mid-level management, approve contracts under $10 million, represent the company in routine business matters. What it explicitly did not include the power to execute asset sales, the power to dissolve equity positions, the power to transfer ownership of a privately held corporation to a third-party buyer. Those powers resided with the shareholders, and the shareholders were controlled by the trust, and the trust was controlled by Bernice, and Bernice answered to me. Keith had won a vote that gave him a title that permitted him to do absolutely nothing he actually needed to do. That evening, Keith and Colleen had celebrated at an elite Houston restaurant, the kind with a wine list that required a sommelier and a reservation that required connections. Colleen had raised her champagne glass, her smile victorious and cold. To modern leadership, to us, to everything we're building. Keith had clinked his glass against hers, his smile genuine in a way that would have broken Joan's heart. 3 weeks until closing. 3 weeks until everything changes. I'd heard about that dinner from Floyd, who'd heard about it from a board member who'd declined their invitation. I'd sat in my study imagining my son toasting his victory, celebrating authority he didn't actually possess, counting votes that had already abandoned him. Everything would change in 3 weeks, Keith, just not the way you thought. Keith left that boardroom in mid-November, holding a document that said Interim Operational Authority, 6 votes. In his favor official corporate seal, his attorney's assurance it was bulletproof. He held a weapon loaded with blanks, he just didn't know it. And in 10 days, he'd try to fire it in front of everyone. While Keith was celebrating phantom authority, I was visiting the place where everything began to remember why I was willing to destroy what I'd built to protect it. The plant still ran 3 shifts, 44 years after I built it, steam rising from exhaust stacks. Into the November night, 340 workers inside who had no idea their livelihoods were being sold by a man who'd never stepped foot on a construction site. Mid-November, late Sunday evening, I'd driven out alone to the industrial zone on Houston's eastern outskirts where the air smelled like metal and diesel and honest work. The original facility, the one I'd financed with that $100,000 loan in 1981 when Joan was pregnant with Keith and we had $73 in our checking account. I parked my sedan outside the chain-link fence, left the engine running, watched. Steam poured from the exhaust stacks in white columns that disappeared into the dark sky. Through the industrial windows, I could see the third shift, moving welders in protective gear, supervisors checking quality control stations, material handlers operating forklifts, with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done the same job for 20 years. Joan would have had something to say about all of this. I could almost hear her voice the way I'd heard it that day in 1981, when we'd stood in the mud right where this fence now stood. "Vernon," she'd said, looking at the empty lot. "I'd just mortgaged our future to purchase. You're betting everything we have on nothing but optimism and an engineer's arrogance." "Give it 20 years, I'd told her. She'd handed me a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Stayed anyway. 44 years later, I was standing at the fence she'd never see, watching the plant she'd helped me build, still running 3 shifts, still employing people whose names I'd never know, but whose paychecks carried my signature. 3,200 employees, total across the entire infrastructure group. Not just this plant. All 4 facilities. The Precision Manufacturing Division, the Energy Systems Division, the Civil Engineering Contracts. Welders, engineers, shift supervisors, administrative staff, ordinary people who showed up, did the work, trusted the name on their paychecks to mean something. Keith was selling their futures, and Keith had never stepped foot on a live construction site, never poured foundation in August heat that could kill a man, never worked a 16-hour shift because the contract deadline was tomorrow and the crew was counting on him. Foundations aren't built in boardrooms. They're poured in mud at dawn by people whose names you'll never know. Keith built nothing. He only inherited, and you cannot sell what you never built. That was the principle, the one Joan would have reminded me of if she'd been standing beside me at this fence. The one that separated ownership from stewardship, inheritance from responsibility. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about pride. It wasn't even about the money. It was about the people inside that building who didn't know their jobs were being auctioned off by someone who thought infrastructure was a spreadsheet line item. I watched for another 5 minutes. Then I got back in my car and drove home. Later that night in my study, I made the call to Bernice I'd been planning for a week. She answered on the first ring. We'd scheduled it. "The Gallagher Legacy Partners portfolio is ready," she said without preamble. "I'm sending you the updated asset summary now." I opened my laptop. Her encrypted file appeared in my secure inbox. I clicked it open. Gallagher Legacy Partners, a completely segregated entity I'd established in 2019, 4 years ago, when renewable energy infrastructure started shifting from experimental to essential. 220 million in equity positions across 3 major Texas utility providers, wind farms, solar installations, grid modernization contracts, 34% ownership stake, controlling interest in 2 of the 3. Nobody on the core corporate board knew it existed. Keith had never seen a single document. Colleen's due diligence had completely missed it. We hold the option to absorb the infrastructure assets if the Apex transaction collapses, Bernice continued. Full restructure without external liquidation. Vernon, why aren't we deploying this? It solves everything quietly. I stared at the numbers on my screen. $220 million. Enough to buy out Apex's offer. Enough to restructure the company independently. Enough to save everything without Keith ever signing a document in front of Dwight Irvine. We won't need that, I said, but it's good to know it's there. Then why keep it? Bernice asked. Why build this if you're not going to use it? I closed the laptop, looked out my study window at the Houston night. Because Keith needs to feel the full weight of what he almost did, I said, not just be stopped taught. A quiet intervention saves him from consequences. A public collapse teaches him what I couldn't teach him in 40 years of trying. What's the difference between stopping someone and teaching them witnesses and consequences? Bernice was quiet for a long moment. You are a cold man sometimes, Vernon Gallagher, she finally said. I'm a prepared man, Bernice, I replied. There's a difference. And I prepared for everything, including the outcome where I have to let my son destroy himself to learn what building something actually means. You're risking the company, she said. No, I corrected. I'm risking Keith's illusion that he owns the company. The actual company, the trust, the employees, the contracts that's protected. The Gallagher Legacy Partners portfolio is the proof. If everything goes wrong, we restructure. But it won't go wrong because I've spent 3 months making sure every piece is exactly where it needs to be. And if Keith never learns, Bernice asked, then at least 3,200 people will keep their jobs, I said. And I'll know I tried every way there is to teach a man you cannot sell what you never built. We hung up. I sat in the dark study, the only light coming from the green banker's lamp on my desk. $220 million in renewable energy, equity, enough to restructure everything, save the company, avoid the collapse entirely. I had the financial safety net. I just chose the moral lesson instead. Because some things can't be taught with money. They have to be taught with consequences. And 2 weeks before the closing, Bernice asked me the question that would determine whether Keith walked into that room or not. December 3rd, 12 days before the ceremony, Bernice sat across from me in my study, the green banker's lamp casting shadows across the legal memorandum she'd placed on my desk. 3 pathways to end this tonight. 3 ways to stop Keith without ever letting him sign a document in front of Dwight Irvine. Section 4.2 of the trust agreement, she said, tapping the first paragraph, grants the trustee absolute veto power over any asset disposition. I invoke it, the transaction terminates immediately. Keith can't appeal, can't negotiate, can't proceed. I read it. 90 seconds of silence. Second option, Bernice continued. Emergency injunction in Delaware Chancery Court. We file based on beneficiary fraud, Keith's misrepresentation of authority, Colleen's forged medical documentation. The court issues a temporary restraining order. Apex walks away tonight. I kept reading. Third option, she said. I notify Prosperity Capital's compliance department about the forged medical documentation. Federal banking regulations require immediate loan cancellation when fraud is discovered. $8 million gets recalled. Colleen can't close without that bridge loan. Deal collapses. I set the memorandum down, looked at Bernice. She'd been my attorney for 37 years. She knew what I was thinking before I said it. Do we stop this now? She asked quietly. Or do we let him walk to the table? I placed the memorandum in my desk drawer, closed it. Let him sign, I said. Let him think he won. Let him stand in front of those 3,200 people and explain what he tried to do. Bernice sat back in her chair. You're a cold man sometimes, Vernon. I'm a prepared man, Bernice, I replied. There's a difference. What's the difference? She asked. I looked at the drawer where I'd just filed away 3 perfectly legal ways to stop my son from destroying himself. A cold man would use one of those options and never tell Keith why. I said, a prepared man lets Keith walk all the way to the signing table, so he understands, really understands the weight of what he almost did. Stopping him privately lets him claim he would have succeeded if not for technicalities. Stopping him publicly in front of Irvine, in front of the board, in front of everyone that teaches him what 42 years of being my son apparently couldn't. And Colleen, Bernice asked. She orchestrated this, I said. She gets the same stage. Bernice nodded, started gathering her papers. Prepare the counter-offensive documentation, I told her. Everything ready for December 15th. Keith gets 12 more days of thinking he won. She left. I sat in my study for a long time after that, thinking about the choice I'd just made. Before I reveal what Keith and Colleen were toasting at their celebration dinner, 2 days later, comment A if you think I should have stopped him sooner, or B if letting him walk to the table was the right choice. Add one reason why. Please note what follows includes some recreated details. For narrative impact, though, the lesson remains true. The confrontation was set, the witnesses were positioned. Now I just had to wait 5 days and watch Keith make it worse. The phone call came at 11:47 p.m., too late for good news, too early for coincidence. I wasn't on the call, but Bernice's monitoring system was. We'd been tracking Colleen's communications for 3 weeks, ever since Senator Fulton's FBI contacts started their preliminary investigation. Colleen answered on the third ring, her voice sharp with the irritation of someone interrupted during their nighttime routine. Margaret, it's almost midnight. Margaret Brennan, former Wharton classmate from Colleen's 2001 MBA cohort, now a senior compliance officer at a Dallas private equity firm, the kind of person who still kept tabs on old classmates and made calls when something felt wrong. Someone's asking about you, Margaret said. About Meridian Capital. I thought you should know. Silence on Colleen's end, 3 seconds, maybe 4. Who's asking? I don't know, Margaret said, but they're asking the right questions. Wire transfers. Client fund discrepancies. The 2003 investigation that got buried, Colleen, I thought that was dead. It is dead, Colleen said, but her voice had changed. Tighter, controlled. It was nothing. Internal review, no charges closed file. Then why is someone digging it up 20 years later? Colleen ended the call 60 seconds after that. Immediately dialed Keith. I heard that call too. We need to push up closing, she said the moment Keith answered. What, Colleen? It's midnight. Can we move it to this week, December 12th, 13th? Can't move December 15th, Keith said. Everything's locked. Irvine's team, the board session, the wire transfers. We move the date, we risk the entire transaction. Someone's investigating Meridian, Colleen said. Your old firm, that was 20 years ago. Nobody cares about... Somebody cares, Colleen interrupted. And they're asking questions 5 days before we close the biggest deal of our lives. That's not coincidence, Keith. But Keith, for once, held firm. December 15th, he said. 5 days, then none of it matters. They hung up. Bernice sent me the transcript at 6:30 the next morning. December 10th. I read it twice over my first cup of coffee. Colleen was panicking. Good. Panic makes people make mistakes. At 8:15, my phone rang. Keith. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. Made my voice sound older, slower, the way someone with cognitive decline might sound on a Monday morning. Hello, Dad. Keith said, his voice carrying that careful brightness people use when they're lying. Just calling to check on you. How are you feeling? I paused. Let the silence stretch just long enough to seem confused. Oh, Keith, that's kind of you. I'm managing. The doctors say, well, they say to rest. Are you eating enough? Taking your medications? Yes. Bernice helps with all that. She's very organized. For 12 minutes, father and son performed concern, both Oscar-worthy, both utterly false. Keith asked about my health. I gave vague answers that suggested decline without confirming anything specific. He asked if I needed anything. I said no, everything was fine. People were very helpful. He never once mentioned the December 15th signing, never mentioned Apex Capital, never said the word acquisition, and I never let on that I knew exactly why he was calling. What Keith was really asking, does Dad know? What I was really answering, I'm too far gone to be a threat. 12 minutes of performance art. 2 men lying to each other while both knew the other was lying. Neither one breaking character. I'll check on you again soon, Dad, Keith finally said. That would be nice, I replied weakly. You're a good son, Keith. He hung up. I sat there in my study for 30 seconds. Then I picked up my phone and texted Bernice 4 words. He just confirmed everything. Her reply came back immediately, 5 days, but Keith wasn't done performing. Not by a long shot. 5 p.m. that same day, Keith held a press conference. He'd arranged it at the corporate headquarters downtown in the press room we used for major contract announcements. Camera crews from local business news, a few financial journalists who covered Houston's corporate sector, and Thomas Ridley. Thomas was 63, a veteran business journalist who'd covered Houston acquisitions for the Chronicle's business section for 30 years. The kind of reporter who actually read SEC filings and asked questions that made executives uncomfortable. I watched the press conference live from my study. Keith stood at a podium with the Gallagher Precision Manufacturing logo behind him. Colleen stood slightly to his left, her smile perfect and cold. I'm pleased to announce, Keith began, that Gallagher Precision Manufacturing has reached an agreement with Apex Industries for a $420 million acquisition that will position both companies for significant growth in the infrastructure sector. The journalists took notes, cameras recorded. Keith talked about synergies, strategic positioning, market expansion, all the corporate language that sounds impressive until you realize it means nothing. Then Thomas Ridley raised his hand. What is Vernon Gallagher's position on this acquisition? Keith smiled, looked directly into the camera. My father has graciously agreed to step down and supports this transition fully. He's been an incredible leader for 48 years, and he recognizes that it's time for the company to evolve under new leadership. You can't untelevise a lie. I watched that moment 3 times. Keith's smile, his confident voice, the way he looked into the camera and told every financial journalist in Houston that his father supported a transaction his father had spent 3 months preparing to destroy. The broadcast aired on Bloomberg, CNBC, Fox Business, local Houston stations, recorded, archived, irreversible. Keith had just guaranteed that when I exposed him on December 15th, it wouldn't be a private family matter. It would be a public humiliation broadcast on every financial channel that had aired his lie. I sat in my study and watched the replay one more time. All right, Keith, I said to the screen. December 15th it is. The fall would match the ambition. Public. Permanent. Impossible to deny. Keith's lie was now on every financial channel. The correction would be 2. 48 hours before execution, I stopped feeling nervous and started feeling ready. December 13th, 2023, 11 p.m. The green banker's lamp cast its familiar glow across my desk as I opened the black notebook one final time. Not to add an entry, there would be no 48th, but to verify. 47 entries documenting Keith's 3-year descent. 47 pieces of a puzzle that would become a guillotine. The checklist sat beside the notebook, 47 items, each one cross-referenced, each one lethal. Item 1, Gallagher Legacy Trust documents. Original 1993 signatures. 72% voting control confirmed. Item 2, Jones Provision. Page 9, paragraph 4. In the event of demonstrated moral incapacity. Item 3, Bernice Caldwell's certification letter, dated November 8th, 2023. Legal authority, absolute. I worked through the list methodically. Financial records, board testimony, audio files, email chains. Each item received a check mark in green ink, the same green as the lamp, the same green as the go signal I'd given Floyd Reyes 10 days earlier. Item 22, Dr. Gerald Hoffman's forged diagnosis, signed August 15th, 2023. FBI file number attached. Item 23, Eloise's 423 audio recording. Keith's voice, December 16th check-in, Sunrise Living. Item 24, Philip Hargrove's bribery email. Subject line, R.E. Gallagher Industries revised terms. $2 million in electronic evidence. The verification took 3 hours. My coffee went cold twice. Outside River Oaks slept under December stars, oblivious to the fact that 42 years of architecture was about to prove its design. Item 39, Dwight Irving's Cooperation Agreement. Signed December 2nd, 2023. Witness testimony secured. Item 40, Senator Fulton's FBI contact confirmation. Agent Patricia Caldwell assigned. Investigation active. Item 41, Colleen Merrick's loan documents. Stuart Langley, private lender. $8 million at 18%. Due December 20th, 2023. 3 hours became 4. The house settled around me. Old wood contracting in winter cold. The same sounds I'd heard for decades. Preparation isn't paranoia when the stakes are absolute. Every detail mattered. Every cross-reference had to hold. Item 47, Tony's Venetian Room Reservation. December 15th, 2023, 6 p.m. 12 guests confirmed. I closed the notebook at 2:17 a.m. The check marks told the story. 47 items, 47 confirmations, 0 gaps. Keith thought he'd stolen a company. He'd actually triggered a trap built across 1,500 days of documentation. I climbed the stairs to the bedroom where Joan and I had slept for 41 years. Her pillow still held its shape, though she'd been gone since 2019. Some absences never fill. It's time, I said to the empty room. The alarm woke me. December 15th at 6:30 a.m., 31 hours. After the verification, 11 and a half hours before the confrontation. I didn't feel nervous. I felt like a man who'd spent 48 years preparing for a single evening, and had run out of preparations. The dawn came cold and clear over River Oaks. Through the bedroom window, I watched Houston wake delivery trucks. On the quiet streets, early commuters hurrying toward the interstate, steam rising from coffee shop vents. Normal Friday morning, normal city, normal people heading to normal jobs, where sons didn't institutionalize fathers and fathers didn't need black notebooks to document betrayal. I showered in silence, shaved with the same straight razor I'd used since 1976, combed my hair still thick at 72, still mostly dark, Joan's genetics winning even after her death. Then I opened the closet. The 1981 suit hung where I'd placed it 3 weeks earlier, navy wool single-breasted narrow lapels. The style that was modern when I wore it to break ground on the Quincy facility. The style that was vintage now 42 years later, but still perfectly pressed. I'd had it cleaned in November. The dry cleaner had asked if it was for a costume party. Something like that, I'd said. The fabric felt heavier than modern suits. Better wool, tighter weave, built to last. I slid the jacket off its hanger and checked the interior pocket. Still there, the photograph from groundbreaking day. 32-year-old Vernon Gallagher in this same suit, holding a shovel, grinning like a man who believed the future was bright. 32-year-old Keith stood beside me in the photo age 6, wearing a yellow hard hat 3 sizes too large. I put the photo back. The pants went on first. Same waist, same inseam. I'd kept myself. In the same shape deliberately, the discipline of a man who knew appearances mattered. The shirt was new, but the style was old white cotton French cuffs, collar stays. The tie was from 1981 navy silk with thin gold stripes. The Windsor knot, still muscle memory. The jacket slid over my shoulders like armor. I stood before the bedroom mirror. The same mirror where Joan had straightened my tie 42 years earlier. The same mirror that had reflected 4 decades of suits and mornings and preparations for lesser battles. The 1981 suit still fit perfectly. Same shoulders, same inseam, same man. 42 years building something, 11 hours to defend it. The navy fabric felt like armor, because that's exactly what it was. I adjusted the cuffs, checked the knot, smoothed the lapels. The navy fabric felt like armor, because that's exactly what it was. The ceremonial dress of a man going to war in the most civilized way possible, with documentation, instead of weapons with witnesses, instead of soldiers with the truth instead of violence. Outside, Boston continued its normal Friday. Inside, I became the version of myself that Keith had forgotten existed, the man who'd built an empire from nothing, who'd survived recessions and competitors, and 48 years of decisions, who'd loved his son enough to let him fail, and who'd prepared well enough to ensure that failure came with consequences. I arrived 15 minutes early because late men lose negotiations before they begin. The 1981 Navy suit served its purpose during the 30-minute drive from River Oaks to downtown Houston. Professional armor. When I stepped into First Continental's marble lobby at 9:30 a.m., I looked exactly like what Keith needed me to be, the distinguished founder, blessing his son's triumph. The 28th floor boardroom was glass and steel, and winter sunlight designed to make billion-dollar deals feel inevitable. Keith had chosen the location deliberately First Continental Financial Center, where Gallagher Industries had maintained banking relationships since 1987. Home field advantage, or so he thought. They were already assembled when I stepped off the elevator at 9:45 a.m. Keith stood near the head of the conference table, navy suit, sharper than mine, silver tie catching the light. Colleen Merrick flanked his right side in crimson power color, strategic choice. 6 board members occupied the far wall, Harold Whitmore, Terrence Callahan, and 4 others whose loyalty Keith believed he'd secured through Floyd Reyes's careful manipulation. Dwight Irvine sat at the opposite end of the table. I'd never met Apex Industries' CEO in person, though I'd studied him thoroughly. 58 years old, MIT engineering background built Apex from a regional parts supplier into a $2 billion industrial conglomerate through aggressive acquisitions. He wore a gray suit that cost less than Keith's but fit better. 2 assistants flanked him, 1 male, 1 female, both holding tablets, both watching everything. A woman in a black blazer stood near the signing table, leather portfolio, open. Rebecca Salazar, licensed notary public, early 50s, professional neutrality, radiating from every gesture. She'd notarize whatever documents crossed her desk as long as the signatures were willing. Media cameras waited in the lobby. I'd seen them on the way in. Keith had arranged a press conference for 10:30 a.m. The announcement would make Bloomberg, CNBC, Wall Street Journal. Gallagher Industries acquired by Apex in $420 million deal. Founder's son leads transition. I poured coffee from the carafe near the window. Took the corner seat, quiet, unobtrusive. Keith's eyes found mine across the room. I smiled, raised my coffee cup slightly. He crossed the boardroom in 6 strides, hand extended, expression cautious but hopeful. Glad you made it, Dad, Keith said. Means a lot. I stood, shook his hand firmly, held his gaze. Wouldn't miss it for anything, son. Keith's shoulders dropped half an inch. Tension releasing, guard lowering. The smile that spread across his face was genuine relief. He'd expected resistance, confrontation, last-minute sabotage. Instead, his father in a vintage suit, coffee in hand, warm handshake, paternal blessing. I watched him believe it. Across the room, Colleen's expression shifted from wary to satisfied. Dwight Irving nodded slightly as if confirming something. Terence Callahan stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Part confusion, part something else. Keith returned to the head of the table, straightened his tie, addressed the room. Let's get started. Rebecca Salazar opened her portfolio, withdrew the master financial authorization form, 18 pages, blue backing, official seals. The document that would release $220 million from escrow and trigger the acquisition's final phase. Wire transfer confirmed, Dwight Irvine said to his assistant, voice carrying across the glass room. $220 million in escrow pending authorization signatures. Keith looked at me like I'd just given him the keys to the kingdom, which in a way I had. The keys to his own destruction. Rebecca Salazar placed the authorization form at the center of the table, arranged pens in a neat row, opened her notary log to a fresh page. We'll proceed in sequence, she said. Voice calm, procedural, efficient. Board authorization signatures first, then corporate officer execution, then escrow release. Keith nodded. Harold, if you would. Harold Whitmore, board chairman, Keith's earliest ally, stepped forward, signed page 12 without reading it. 4 other board members followed in quick succession. Signatures, initials, dates. The sound of pens on paper filled the glass room like whispered promises. Then Terence Callahan's turn. Rebecca slid the form across the table. 10 feet of polished mahogany between her and Terence. The document stopped directly in front of his seat. 10:02 a.m. 5 seconds of silence. Terence stared at the blue-backed pages. His right hand rested beside the pen Rebecca had placed there. Fingers not moving, eyes not blinking. Keith leaned forward slightly. Terence, the silence stretched, tightened, became suffocating. I watched Keith's expression shift confidence to concern to something harder. A warning forming behind his eyes. Terence's hand moved, not to the pen, to his lap. I can't sign this, Terence said. His voice was quiet, trembling, but clear. The boardroom froze. Keith's head snapped toward Terence. What? I can't sign this, Terence repeated. Terence! Keith's voice sharpened, anger bleeding through the professional veneer. What the hell are you? I'm sorry, Keith. Terence's hands shook now, visible tremor. I just can't. The room plunged into shocked silence. Harold Whitmore stared, mouth slightly open. Colleen's face went rigid, crimson suit, suddenly too bright against her pale skin. Rebecca Salazar's pen hovered mid-notation in her logbook. Dwight Irvine sat up straight, eyes narrowing as he recalculated the mathematics of a collapsing acquisition. Keith stood, both hands flat on the mahogany table. Terence, we talked about this. You agreed. I know what I agreed to. Terence's voice cracked on the last word. I'm sorry. I can't do it. 5 seconds of silence can destroy $220 million. Keith's face darkened from confusion to fury. You understand what you're doing. You're killing this deal. You're destroying... I understand, Terence whispered. My phone vibrated. I glanced down at the screen. One word. Ready. Bernice Caldwell. Terence's pen rested on unsigned paper. Keith's face drained of color as the full implication registered. One missing signature invalidated the entire authorization sequence. Froze the escrow release, triggered material breach clauses in 40 pages of acquisition agreements. Dwight Irvine's hand moved toward his phone, already calculating legal exposure and fiduciary liability. The dam broke. Terence's refusal wasn't spontaneous courage, born from last-minute conscience. It was choreography. The signal we'd coordinated 3 weeks earlier when I'd promised him protection in exchange for this single act of defiance at the precise moment when Keith's overconfidence would be absolute. Bernice's text confirmed every piece was now in motion. The doors opened at 10:08 a.m. exactly. Bernice Caldwell was never late. I stood phone to my ear as if taking an urgent call. Through the glass doors, I saw Bernice in the corridor. Dark gray suit, leather briefcase expression carved from stone. I nodded once, returned to the table. "Sit down, Keith," I said. My son stared at me, confusion bleeding into something darker. "Dad, what?" The boardroom doors opened fully. Bernice Caldwell entered like a judge, taking the bench. 63 years old, 35 years of corporate law in her posture. Joan's closest friend since 1988, my general counsel since 1993, executor of a trust Keith didn't know existed. She placed her briefcase on the glass table with a sound like a gavel. "Good morning, my name is Bernice Caldwell. I am general counsel for the Gallagher Legacy Trust." Keith's face went blank. Dwight Irvine sat up straighter. Bernice opened the briefcase, withdrew 3 documents, arranged them in a neat row. The Gallagher Legacy Trust was established in 1993 by Vernon and Joan Gallagher. It holds 72% of voting rights in Gallagher Precision Manufacturing. She placed her hand flat on the center document. "This transaction cannot proceed. It has never been authorized by the trust. The deal is dead." Silence crashed through the room. Keith stood chair scraping backward. "Dad, what is this?" "Sit down," I repeated. He didn't. He stared at the documents, then at Bernice, then at me. Processing, calculating, realizing. Colleen Merrick's crimson suit suddenly looked like blood against pale skin. Bernice picked up the first document. Gallagher Legacy Trust Charter. Signed November 12th, 1993. Joan Marie Gallagher Vernon. Theodore Gallagher, witnessed by attorney Patricia Brennan. She turned it toward Keith. 42-year-old signatures in blue ink. 72% voting control. "You never had authority to sell this company, Keith. You never had the votes." Keith's mouth opened, closed, no sound emerged. Dwight Irvine leaned forward, scanning the document. His expression shifted from confused to calculating to professionally furious in 3 seconds. Bernice picked up the second document. Medical records from Dr. Holly Finch Vernon Gallagher's primary physician of 18 years. Comprehensive cognitive assessment dated October 2023. Executive function normal. Memory normal. Decision-making capacity fully intact. She placed it beside the trust charter. "The dementia diagnosis you used to justify this acquisition was forged by Dr. Gerald Hoffman. The FBI received those files this morning." Keith's knees buckled. He caught himself on the table edge. "No," he whispered. "No, why we had documentation." "You had fraud," Bernice said. She picked up the third item, a small digital recorder, silver red light blinking. Audio recording captured November 28th, 2023 at Keith Gallagher's residence. Speakers Keith Gallagher and Colleen Merrick. She pressed play. Keith's voice filled the boardroom. "Once the doctors sign off, we can move him to Sunrise Living. 6 months, maybe less. By the time anyone questions it, the acquisition will be closed, and I'll have full operational control." Colleen's voice, "And if he resists?" "He won't have a choice. The medical documentation establishes incapacity. We move forward." The recording played for 47 seconds. Keith's entire future collapsed in less than a minute. Bernice pressed stop. The silence felt like suffocation. Keith stared at the recorder, face gone from pale to gray. Dwight Irvine stood, buttoned his suit jacket with precise movements. "You should have told me the truth, Keith," Irvine said. "Apex doesn't do business with liars." He nodded to his assistants. They gathered their tablets and followed him toward the doors. Rebecca Salazar, the notary, packed her materials and disappeared into the corridor. The boardroom emptied. Harold Whitmore, Terrence Callahan, the other board members gone in 60 seconds. Keith stood frozen, watching his acquisition die in real time. Bernice turned to Colleen. "Stuart Langley is on the line. Your lender. He's received documentation of material fraud in your loan application. I suggest you remain seated for that conversation." Colleen's hands shook violently. Her phone began vibrating silent mode, but the tremor visible against glass. She stared at it like a loaded weapon. Bernice walked to the doors, closed them. The magnetic lock engaged with a soft click. Only 3 of us remained. I stood, walked to the window. 28 floors above downtown Houston spread out in winter sunlight, oblivious, continuing as if nothing had changed. "You didn't lose the company today," I said. "You lost it the day you started seeing me as an obstacle instead of a father." Keith slumped into his chair, stared at his hands. "I had a plan. Transfer full control on my 75th birthday, December 2025. 2 years from now, Keith." His head snapped up. 2 years. That's all you had to wait. The transfer documents were drafted in 2022, stored in the trust archive, scheduled, signed, witnessed. $800 million in patient inheritance. What's 2 years of patience worth? Apparently $380 million and your father's trust. I turned from the window, looked at my son, 42 years old, silver tie, perfect face destroyed. You threw away $800 million for a $420 million fraud and a woman who saw you as a vehicle, not a partner. Colleen's phone continued vibrating. Stuart Langley calling about an $8 million loan, now in material default. She stood, walked to the doors, left without speaking. The lock clicked behind her. Keith and I sat alone in the glass boardroom. 42 years of fatherhood, 48 years of building, 3 years watching him rot. 47 notebook entries, one phone call in August that started this. 2 years, that was all he had to wait. I'd written the transfer documents in 2022, stored them in the trust archive, scheduled them for my 75th birthday, December 2025. Keith chose betrayal over patience, 420 million over 800 million, Colleen's manipulation over his father's plan. After the room emptied, only father and son remained, and 42 years of silence between them. Keith sat motionless at the conference table, staring at the unsigned authorization form Rebecca Salazar had left behind. The blue backing looked obscene, now official seals mocking what should have been his triumph. His hands rested flat on mahogany fingers, spread like he was trying to hold on to something already gone. I stood by the window. 28 floors below, financial district workers hurried through lunch hour, normal Friday, normal lives, unaware that $800 million had just evaporated in a glass room above them. Why didn't you stop me sooner? Keith's voice was barely audible. You knew. You watched me. Why didn't you just stop me? I turned from the window. Because you needed to see it, I said. Not hear it. See it all the way to the end. See what? His voice cracked. My own destruction. See the consequences of every choice, every decision, every betrayal. Keith finally looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed face, aged a decade in an hour. I thought I was building something, he said. For the family. For the future. You hired 3 lawyers before you called your father, I said quietly. You consulted acquisition specialists, financial advisors, and a woman who saw you as a transaction. When did you consult the man who built what you were trying to steal? The word hung between us. Steal. Keith flinched like I'd struck him. I never... He stopped, started again. I didn't think of it that way. I know, I said. That's the problem. You stopped thinking of me as a father and started thinking of me as an obstacle. The company became more important than the man who built it. The money became more important than the trust. Silence stretched between us. Outside, a siren wailed ambulance, or police fading into the city's background noise. What happens now? Keith asked. You rebuild, I said. Reputation, relationships, trust. All of it earned back one day at a time. How? Everyone knows. Everyone knows you tried to force your father into a nursing home to steal his company. Yes, that's the truth you'll carry. But truth has 2 parts, Keith. What you did and what you do next. I walked to the table, sat across from him, father and son separated by 10 feet of polished wood and 3 years of rot documented in 47 notebook entries. You're still my son, I said. That doesn't go in a trust. Can't be sold or taken, but it has to be earned back. Do you understand? Keith's jaw clenched. For a moment I thought he'd argue, defend, deflect the same patterns that had led him here. Instead, something broke in his expression. I understand, he whispered. Keith had spent 42 years as someone's son. He'd spent 47 minutes learning what that actually meant. I stood, buttoned my suit jacket, the 1981 navy wool, that had witnessed this entire day from dawn preparation to boardroom devastation. Go home, I said, not to Colleen's house, home. Think about who you want to be when you rebuild. I left him in the glass conference room alone with unsigned papers and the ghost of the man he'd tried to become. 3 hours later, Colleen Merrick's phone rang. Stuart Langley, the private lender who'd extended $8 million at 18% interest, delivered the news with professional courtesy. Material Adverse Change Clause Section 7.2. The acquisition's collapse constitutes material breach. Full principal due within 72 hours. Colleen tried to negotiate. Langley was unmoved. The loan documents were airtight. Bernice had reviewed them personally, confirmed every exit clause, every trigger provision. When the deal died, so did Colleen's extensions. $8 million, 72 hours. The Beacon Hill estate deposit $300,000 was legally forfeited under seller's contract terms. The yacht deposit $120,000 seized by brokers within 6 hours. Upscale restaurants called about $18,000 in cancellation penalties for events Colleen had booked to celebrate Keith's acquisition. 3 phone calls in 6 hours, 8,420,000 and 20 years minimum. The last number came from Gerald Moss, criminal defense attorney from Houston's most prestigious white-collar firm. 46 years old, Georgetown Law, 15 years defending executives who'd made expensive mistakes. He sat across from Colleen in a mahogany-paneled office that cost $750 an hour to occupy. Ms. Merrick, Moss said, arranging 3 folders on his desk. I've reviewed the evidence the FBI received this morning. Colleen's hands shook. The crimson suit from the signing now looked like costume from a play that had closed badly. Can we fight it? She asked. Fight what exactly? Moss opened the first folder. Federal wire fraud. Your Meridian Capital scheme moved money across state lines electronically. 20 years maximum. Second folder. Bank fraud. You falsified financial statements to secure an $8 million loan. 30 years maximum. Third folder. Healthcare fraud. You conspired with Dr. Gerald Hoffman to forge medical documents declaring Vernon Gallagher mentally incompetent. 10 years maximum. He closed the folders, looked at her with the expression defense attorneys reserve for clients whose guilt is documented, witnessed, and recorded. 60 years cumulative maximum, Moss said. Realistically, the U.S. attorney will offer a plea for 15 to 20. If we go to trial and lose, which we will, because Bernice Caldwell delivered 20 years of documentation, you're looking at the high end. How long? Colleen whispered. This is going to be a very long year, Moss said quietly, and I mean that literally. Bernice Caldwell hand-delivered the files to Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Cunningham on December 18th, 2023. 3 folders. 2 decades of evidence. 1 conversation. Everything you need is in these files, Bernice said. 20 years overdue. Keith faced rebuilding reputation relationships. Trust earned back 1 day at a time under his father's conditional grace. Colleen faced prison, federal wire fraud bank, fraud healthcare fraud. Documentation already delivered to Assistant U.S. Attorney. Justice was served, but only one of them got mercy. The lawsuit arrived Tuesday morning via certified mail. $2.3 million in consequences, delivered to Keith's doorstep in 12 pages. Dwight Irvine's legal team had moved fast. Material misrepresentation, fraudulent inducement, breach of good faith dealing. The complaint itemized everything due diligence, cost legal fees, opportunity loss from the collapsed acquisition. Apex Industries wanted every dollar back, plus damages. Keith's attorney, Bradley Morrison, stopped returning calls on Wednesday. By Thursday, Morrison faced his own problem, Texas bar ethics complaint alleging complicity in Keith's fraudulent scheme. Potential disbarment. Morrison's career hung on proving he'd been deceived, along with everyone else. Keith was alone. Friday afternoon, my phone rang. Not my cell, my home landline, the number only family knew. Dad? Keith's voice sounded hollow, distant. Background noise suggested a payphone. I need a lawyer. Morrison won't take my calls. I don't know who else to ask. I sat in my study, the black notebook closed on the desk. 47 entries documenting 3 years of rot. The story was finished now. What came next was epilogue. I know a good one, I said. Marcus Reyes, corporate defense white-collar litigation. He's not cheap. I'll pay whatever it costs. Good, I said. That's a start. Silence on the line. Traffic noise in the background. Keith breathing. You're not going to help me with this, are you? He asked quietly. No, I said. You need to carry this weight yourself, all of it. That's how you learn what it weighs. I understand. He hung up without saying goodbye. I didn't offer money, didn't offer connections beyond the name, didn't offer to call Marcus myself and smooth the introduction. Keith had chosen this path, hired lawyers, forged documents, planned institutionalization, betrayed trust. The economic consequences were his to shoulder alone. Redemption starts with accountability, not rescue. December 20th. Small conference room at Gallagher Precision Manufacturing Headquarters. No glass walls, this time just oak paneling, leather chairs, and 3 people who'd known each other for decades. Bernice Caldwell sat across from Keith, binding resolutions, arranged in front of her like evidence at trial. I sat at the head of the table. Keith sat alone on the other side. Executive Vice President title effective immediately terminated. Bernice read. Her voice was steady, professional, final. Voting rights associated with employee stock options immediately revoked. Future inheritance rights under Gallagher Legacy Trust terminated pursuant to material breach of fiduciary duty, clause section 12, paragraph 4. She slid the document across the table. Sign at the bottom, she said. Keith picked up the pen. Read through the 3-page resolution, every word, every clause, every formal severance of the future he'd tried to steal and the inheritance he'd thrown away. He signed in 11 seconds. Keith signed away his inheritance in 11 seconds. It had taken 42 years to qualify for it. Bernice collected the document, placed it in her briefcase. The meeting had lasted 6 minutes. Keith stood, walked to the threshold, stopped. Is there any way back? He asked without turning around. I looked at my son's shoulders slumped, defeated, carrying weight he'd never felt before. There's always a way back, Keith, I said. But it starts on a construction site, not in a boardroom. He nodded once, left without another word. The door closed. Bernice and I sat in silence. Do you mean that? She asked quietly. I don't know yet, I said. Ask me in 2 years. December 22nd, my study at home. The green banker's lamp cast familiar shadows across the desk where I'd written 47 notebook entries and read Joan's letters and planned the architecture of justice. Eloise Gallagher sat in the chair across from me. 19 years old. Keith's daughter from his first marriage, abandoned when he divorced her mother 8 years ago, barely spoken to in the years since. The young woman who'd sent me the audio recording that destroyed her father's scheme. We'd never met in person before today. Grandpa, she said, first time she'd called me that. I got your letter. The scholarship. I didn't do anything. I just sent you that recording because it felt wrong. You did everything, sweetheart, I said. You told the truth when everyone else chose lies. That's not nothing. That's everything. I opened the folder on my desk. Trust documents, amended and restated. The Gallagher Legacy Trust had been converted into something new. Gallagher Foundation Technical Scholarship Fund. Inaugural endowment. First recipient. Joan Gallagher Engineering Scholarship, I said. Full tuition 4 years. Room, board, books, research stipend. Named after your grandmother. Awarded to the student who demonstrates both technical excellence and moral courage. I slid the letter across the desk. You're the first recipient, Eloise, and I can't think of anyone who deserves it more. Her hands shook as she read the letter. Tears tracked down her cheeks, silent at first, then accompanied by small sounds of disbelief and grief and something like relief. Your grandmother would have liked you very much, I said quietly. You wear her courage. Eloise looked up at me with Joan's eyes clear, honest, unafraid of truth. Legacy doesn't travel through blood. It travels through choices. Keith had been groomed for succession since childhood. 42 years of preparation, mentorship, investment. He'd chosen betrayal, fraud, institutionalization, thrown it all away for money, and a woman who saw him as transaction. Eloise had been abandoned at 14. 5 years of silence from her father. She'd chosen truth with a single audio recording. The true heir wore her grandfather's name and her grandmother's courage, 19 years old. Engineering student, abandoned daughter who chose truth over family loyalty. Keith had thrown away his inheritance. Eloise earned hers with a single act of moral clarity. The dust settled faster than I expected. Justice is slow, but Houston business moves like lightning. December 23rd. Dwight Irvine's letter arrived via courier, not process server. Thick cream stationery, Apex Industries letterhead, handwritten signature. Despite recent events, my clean energy partnership offer stands. You defended something worth defending. When you're ready to discuss legitimate joint ventures, not acquisitions, my door remains open. Respectfully, Dwight Irvine. I set the letter on my desk beside 3 other partnership proposals that had arrived in the past week. Wall Street Journal had published the exclusive hostile takeover neutralized by 30-year trust. Gallagher Precision founder defends empire through strategic architecture. The article made me sound like Sun Tzu. Bernice had laughed when she read it. The business world doesn't mourn collapsed deals. It studies them, learns from them, then moves on to the next opportunity. December 26th, FBI transitioned from investigation to formal indictment. Colleen Merrick faced arraignment in January 2024. Federal, wire fraud, bank fraud, healthcare fraud. Her defense attorney had stopped returning reporter calls. December 27th. I signed the paperwork, making Terrence Callahan permanent chief financial officer. Terrence had earned it 5 seconds of courage at the signing table, refusing to put pen to paper when everyone else had already signed. Sometimes the most important decisions are the ones you don't make. December 28th. Floyd Reyes called my cell. "We're too old for this kind of drama, Vernon," Floyd said. I could hear the smile in his voice, the tone of a man who'd watched the whole thing unfold from his board seat and enjoyed every minute. "Speak for yourself, Floyd," I said. "I'm just getting started." He laughed. "Starting what you already won. Winning isn't the same as finishing." December 29th. I returned to my top floor executive office for the first time since the evidence clearance. The staff had meticulously restored everything. Every book to its shelf coordinate, every file to its cabinet drawer, every painting hung at precisely the correct height. Bernice had kept memory logs of the office layout, photographed every surface before Keith's people stripped it bare. The green banker's lamp sat in its proper place on the mahogany desk. The leather chair faced the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Houston's sprawl. 48 years in this office, this view, this seat. One modification: a framed photograph sat on the desk corner where Joan's picture used to rest. 8-year-old Keith at the first job site, 1993, holding an oversized yellow hard hat 3 sizes too large, grinning up at his father with the uncomplicated joy of a child who thought construction sites were adventure playgrounds and companies were things fathers built for sons to inherit. I stared at the photo for a long time, reached into my coat pocket, extracted the small childhood hard hat I'd rescued from Keith's stripped office drawer. Weeks ago, the same yellow hard hat from the photograph preserved for 30 years, forgotten in a drawer by the man who'd once worn it. I placed it gently beside the frame. The photo showed what was lost. The hard hat beside it showed what might still be saved. I turned to the windows. Houston stretched to the horizon under winter sky downtown. Towers, residential sprawl, industrial zones, the port of Houston barely visible in the distance. Somewhere in that landscape, Keith was beginning whatever came next. Somewhere, Eloise was packing for spring semester at MYT. Somewhere, Colleen was meeting with lawyers who charged by the minute to deliver bad news. My eyes found the familiar silhouette, the 1981 Plant Original facility, exhaust stacks rising against gray sky. Still standing, still working. 340 employees on the floor, making precision parts for aerospace contracts, medical devices, clean energy infrastructure. The empire was still there, only the air had changed. December 31st, New Year's Eve. I sat alone in the leather chair as 2023's final hours slipped away. The office was dark except for the green banker's lamp and the glow of Houston's skyline through the windows. Most of the city was at parties, restaurants, celebrations. I preferred quiet. I poured a single glass of whiskey Jameson 18-year neat, Joan's preferred brand. She'd developed the taste during a business trip to Dublin in 1987, insisted it was smoother than the bourbon I drank, made me try it every anniversary until I converted. I raised the glass toward the window. "Joan," I said to the empty office, to the memory of the woman who'd signed the trust documents in 1993 and trusted me to use them wisely. "You'd tell me I was too calculated, that I should have just talked to Keith, worked it out like family. You'd worry about him, cry for him probably. Then you'd hand me a sandwich and tell me I did the right thing anyway." I sipped the whiskey, smooth warm exactly as she'd promised, stared into the dark winter night. Distant fireworks began igniting over the Houston skyline, early celebrations from impatient neighborhoods, bursts of color against black. "I don't know if I did," I said quietly, "but I built this company to last. Built it to survive bad decisions, hostile takeovers, sons who forgot what loyalty meant. Built it to employ 3,000 people, whether or not my son deserved to lead them." My eyes rested on the photograph of 8-year-old Keith. Some lessons can't be taught, only built one painful brick at a time. "This one's for you, Joan," I said. "All of it. The company, the foundation, Eloise's scholarship, Keith's second chance if he takes it. All of it. Always was." The clock struck midnight. Fireworks exploded across Houston's skyline, red, gold, silver bursting against winter black. The city celebrated 2024's arrival with light and sound and the collective hope that new years bring fresh starts. I raised the glass one final time, to the window, to Joan's memory, to the company that survived, to the son who might return, to 48 years of building things designed to last longer than the man who built them. I built things to last, including the parts that hurt, On to To you listening to my story, remember this. A father's revenge isn't always about destroying what was taken. Sometimes it's about preserving what was built. I spent 3 years documenting my son's betrayal. Some might say I was cold, calculated, unforgiving. Maybe they're right, but my mistake wasn't being too careful. It was waiting so long before I faced the truth. Don't make my mistake. When someone you love starts looking at your legacy like it's their entitlement, trust your instincts. Here's what I learned about a father's revenge. It's not about winning, it's about teaching. Keith needed to see the consequences, not just hear about them, but live them. The hardest part of being a father isn't protecting your children from failure. It's letting them fail when that's the only way they'll learn. I believe God put me through this for a reason, to show that strength isn't power over others, but the discipline to use it wisely. A father's revenge done right looks less like destruction and more like construction, building a lesson that lasts. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in my position? If you know someone who needs to hear this, please share it. And if you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Father's Vengeance for more stories about difficult choices and even harder lessons. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your time means more to me than you know. Just a reminder, some details in this story have been fictionalized for storytelling purposes. What matters most is the lesson, and I hope it stays with you long after this video ends.